inadequate.
Yeah. Okay. We're gone live.
There's no time for excuses. Get better results with Exults.com. Or visit Exults.com now.
Good morning, Galen.
Morning. I'm going to try to switch to my headphones here. Good morning. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Yes, morning, Galen.
Not that I represent everyone, but yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
Jan, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you very well. Thank you.
Richard, you have some slides, right, that you're going to show on the update on the COVID-19.
I do. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And you're going to control those, right?
With a bit of luck.
Yeah.
Hello. Hello, Galen.
Good morning, Stavros.
How are you? Good to see you.
Doing fine.
Hello, everybody.
Morning, Stavros.
Paul, welcome. It's good to see you.
Morning, Stavros.
Thank you. Thank you, Stavros. Nice to be with you.
James, do you have any slides for the monitoring group update, or are you just going to talk
No, there's no
about it for a
slides.
few minutes? Okay.
No.
Okay.
I think he does have slides.
Not for this session though, because it's only
Oh,
5
no?
minutes. Yeah.
No.
It's a very brief update.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Good.
We'll just have to settle for his handsome face.
Oh well, you're out of luck. You'll get a face, Jeff. That's all you get.
Okay.
Nice birthday qualifier.
Still dark here, so
I was about to ask you how you're doing. Are you having enough coffee over there?
I'm having tea this morning.
Okay. That's
With
good.
our, yeah. Dawn, how are you doing in Canada?
I'm fine. How about yourself?
Great. Or is winter on its way?
Fall certainly is starting to roll in, sadly.
It's that time of year that I always cringe.
Yeah, it's coming.
Seem to have a good list, I see. I just went through the names. Hello, everyone.
I think we have almost 100%
That's
attendance, or at least people signed up for attendance. There were two that I think they were observers. Yeah. No. Well, Jeff, you let me know when you're ready to start here.
Okay. Wait a minute. Good morning, Sylvie. Thanks for joining us.
Hello.
Hello, Sylvie.
Hi.
Morning.
Is Richard with us? Is Richard on?
I see him. I see his name.
It's
We
on-
talked
it's
a minute ago.
Richard's here.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
And Ken is just joining us now.
Well, maybe we should start.
Yes.
What do you think?
Yes, Stavros. I think we're ready to go, Galen.
Okay. Well, we'll begin then. I'll have a few introductory remarks and to introduce some people. Thank you and welcome to everybody to this CAG Ethics Board CAG session. We really have a great agenda laid out ahead of us today and for 2 following days. You might be wondering why we're doing it over a course of 3 days. It's to try to keep the sessions short enough on Zoom so that we are all focused and have our attention. We'll have one break today, and I'm saying this morning, and I recognize that people are logging in from all different time zones. So last time we met was in person. This is our first time with a virtual meeting. There are some challenges with it, but most of these meetings that I've been in so far have worked out very, very well. But welcome to all the CAG representatives. It'll be nice to meet again in person someday. We look forward to that. I'd like to welcome Dr. Stavros Stamadakis, the IESB chair. He's with us, as well as Deputy Chair Richard Fleck. And joining us again is Shigeo Kashiwagi from Japan. Is logged in, probably in the middle of the night over there. Joining us after he was with us in our last meeting. Also want to welcome a brand new CAG representative. We have Paul Munter. He is representing IOSCO. Paul is Deputy Chief Accountant of International Activities with the Office of the Chief Accountant of the U.S. SEC. We're very lucky to have him with us. He and his office lead the activities with the SEC, the interface with IOSCO, the IASB, as well as the IAASB, and the IESBA. I'd also want to welcome George Cabway. And George, since I haven't met you in person, I hope I've pronounced that appropriately. He's representing the International Monetary Fund as an official observer for this meeting. And George is the Division Chief of the Safeguards Assessment Division in the Finance Department over at the IMF. Let's see. It's always sad to have someone go, and especially when you can't wish them well as they depart. We had Nigel James, and he was replaced by Paul Munter. And Nigel just made some tremendous contributions to the CAG over the years, and we'll certainly miss him. Also, Simon Bradbury from the IMF. He was on the CAG for a good long time. Both of these gentlemen have attained their maximum number of years that they can participate on the CAG due to the rotation requirements that we have. So with us today, well, over our entire 3-day meeting, we'll have a number of task force chairs, all of whom are current ethics board members, with the exception of Sylvie Soulier, who has just rotated recently off the board, but she is still the task force chair on 2 of our task force, one of which we'll hear from late in our first agenda item on objectivity of appropriate reviewers. So thank you, Sylvia, for continuing your service. Well, Brian Friedrich, that'll be talking to us about technology task force chair. Ian McPhee will be with us on the 2nd day. He is the task force chair on the fees project. And then Richard will update us as the task force chair on the non-attest services project on the 2nd day. And then on the 3rd day, that will consist largely of well, it'll be a joint session with the IESBA CAG. And I'd like to make sure that we welcome Jim Dalkin, who's also a member of the IESBA Ethics CAG. And so we'll hear from Mike on the 3rd day of our meeting. We also have a number of public observers that are with us, other board members of the ethics board, Imran Bankar, Robert Dorr, Julia Corden, and a technical advisor, Wolfgang Bohm, is with us. I'm not going to introduce all of the IESBA staff, but I would like to recognize James Gunn, the Managing Director of Professional Standards, and Ken Seong, who is the Ethics Senior Technical Director. So thank everyone for this great participation in our meeting today. Just want to remind on a little bit of protocol about a virtual meeting. Just a quick reminder for the following type of house rules. If you're not speaking, we'd ask you to be sure that your microphone is on mute. If you do wish to make a comment, we'd ask you to raise your right hand, and we'll try to take people in a logical sequence. And you should find that raised right hand in the lower right-hand corner, and probably everybody knows that by now with all the Zoom meetings that you've attended. After you've talked and made your point, maybe if you could lower your hand again and place yourself on mute. And just as a reminder, if you don't know how to lower your hand, you just click it again, click the raise hand, and that'll lower it for you. So just some highlights of the agenda since our March meeting. The comment period for the non-assurance of services and the fees drafts finished in June. Thank you for all of your organizations that provided your feedback. You'll have an opportunity to comment on both of those task force proposals on our 2nd day. And then also in June, the IESBA approved the role and mindset final text, subject to now PIOB approval, and the final pronouncement is expected to be issued in October, and it will be effective December 31st, 2021, with early adoption permitted. Now, as I said, our meeting will be divided into 3 days: today, and then next week on September 10th, and then October 13th. And then next week, there will also be 2 IESBA CAG meetings for many of you that will be attending that, or most of you that will be attending that. And that'll be on September 8th and September 9th. So I actually kind of like this format because it allows us to prepare over a longer period of time for these meetings. So today we'll have an update on the what we're calling the Objectivity of Appropriate Reviewers Task Force, and the task force chair will present the key comments of their exposure draft, as well as that task force responses and their proposals. That task force is hoping to look for approval from the board on the final text in their meeting that is coming up a couple weeks out here. The technology task force chair, after our break, will present its preliminary views on 7 recommendations that they have outlined in their project proposal. All right, and then, so the first part of our meeting here, we normally look at a review or a draft of the minutes of our prior meeting. It's not, those are not quite ready yet. You'll be getting those in an email in the next few days, and then we'll call for an approval of those minutes in day 2 of our meeting. And you'll have an opportunity at that time to make any comments on the approval of that. Then we'll ask you also to read through the report back on the role and mindset project and the discussions that have taken place on that. And you would have gotten an agenda item A2 that sets all of that out. So before we start our main sessions today, though, we have 2 brief updates, and Richard Fleck is going to give us an update on the IESBA's COVID-19 responses with I think it's a working group, Richard, with the National Standard Setters Group that has been formed. So Richard, I'm going to turn the time to you here.
Thank you, Galen. I'm just going to try and do share screen. Hope I get this right. So that you can see this. Have you got the screen in front of you? I hope you have.
Yes, we have, Richard. Thanks.
It's there.
Excellent. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm going to give you a brief update on how IESBA has been handling issues to do with COVID-19. And I'm going to take it quite quickly because I think most of you will know much of what I'm going to say, but most importantly, I want to make sure you know what we're doing in order to try and help the profession in this time and ensure that it is able, or it does, observe the right ethical standards, notwithstanding the pressures that it's under. So, to state the obvious, the pandemic has given rise to huge health, social and financial issues, and lots of challenges for all parts of the economy, and the accountancy profession is no exception. One of the things that we concluded was really important to emphasize was that financial statements haven't lost their importance in these times. Indeed, they're probably much more important and will be increasingly important as we go forward. And so the role of ethics at this time is also very critical. And there were a number of particular points that are, if you like, pressure points for the profession. Obviously, one is the scope for misleading information. The second is the risk of fraud or people taking advantage inappropriately of things like government support packages. And above all else, there's great temptation to be helping one's client, and therefore the independence requirements are under pressure. So, and this applies across the board. So there are all sorts of ways in which these pressures can arise. First of all, people are working at home, which means they don't have the support systems around them. There's scope for bias on business judgments. I mean, you can see the slide. Security risks are heightened. and there are also new laws to become familiar with. So as far as IESBA is concerned, we've obviously moved to virtual board meetings, and also all the task force and working group meetings are taking place remotely, which is a challenge, although in some senses I think there have been some benefits. I actually think that they are, some of the meetings are more efficient as a result of it, because the focus is on getting the job done in the time available, because there's a limit to how long everybody wants to stare at a computer screen. Perhaps a negative of the immediate situation for IESBA is the fact that there is much more difficult for stakeholders to respond on a timely basis. They have more to try and coordinate. You can't do it so easily through meetings, and that impacts the time frame. Indeed, we saw that in relation to the exposure drafts on fees and non-assurance services, where we extended the timetable by a month to give people more time to respond. As far as IESBA is concerned, we've been focusing on completing non-assurance services and fees. And as you heard from Galen, we'll be coming back to that on the 10th of September. One of the things that we did also was to prepare some Q&As, some question and answers were prepared by the staff, and they were released in May 2020. And I think it's fair to say they've gone down very well. It's quite an extensive document. It covers all the areas where one might be concerned or might need to be on alert, that the circumstances might be more acute because of COVID-19. And so I think from that point of view, that was an important initiative. That publication highlighted particular areas, highlighted the importance of focusing on fundamental principles and ensuring that they are complied with, looked at areas like safeguards, pressure, preparing and presenting information, and non-compliance with laws and regulations. And it looked at all these issues from the perspective of different types of accountants who are preparers, those who work in the public sector, educators, and also obviously professional accountants in practice. And all of this focused on maintaining and optimizing independence of auditors in the appropriate place, in the appropriate sector. We also set up a web page, IESBA COVID-19 web page, which we've used to obviously publish that Q&A, but also to provide links to other useful resources. And most importantly, we have set up a working group involving representatives of various national standard setters to help look at ways in which we can help the profession. So we secured the input from representatives from Australia, Canada, China, South Africa, the UK, and the US. And they have been remarkably supportive at this time. And we've had the benefit of being able to talk to them about the particular issues that they think or they've experienced or identified in their jurisdictions. And they've been fairly varied. And that working group has met, I think, 5 times now in the space of just over 3 months. And we have produced one publication, which in conjunction with the Australians, which was in relation to a whole series of tax issues that were arising and which they were encountering in Australia. And that has been, was developed and uses case studies to communicate the lessons to be learned and the warnings to be given. And we have a number of other publications which are very close to being finalized. One is in relation to fraud, and that is being done by the South Africans. and in conjunction or with it will be a paper on various types of illegality to deal with things like money laundering and cyber security, which is being prepared by the Canadians. The US has looked at the use of specialists in the current environment, the circumstances in which it's important to think of turning to specialists, and also the importance of how to involve them whilst observing the appropriate ethical requirements. And then the UK is looking at some of the issues that that have been encountered in relation to government support programs and the work that the things to watch out for. Certainly, there have been some instances or concerns about whether people have been, let's say, economical with the truth when compiling their applications. And this paper will be looking at the different ways in which the accountancy profession risks being involved with that, and how it can, and to put it on alert as to how to avoid those situations arising. And in fact, the person who's working on that with us is actually also working with the government on their experiences. So this is a fairly well researched and informed paper, as indeed all of them have been. So I must say, this has been, to my mind, a remarkably successful operation, timely, responsive to a situation which is unprecedented for all of us. People have been very open with their learning and their ability to help, and they've also done the drafting of the initial documents and been responsive to the way input from the rest of the working group. I'd like to think that this is a precursor to much more occasions and initiatives where we've been able to get representatives of various different jurisdictions participating on in an active basis in this sort of way. I think it's exemplary, and really want to record that, put that on the record. So that's where that's got to so far. As I said, the resource page has these documents on it. It also has a number of other publications referenced, including those produced by IESBA, IPSASB, the public sector, and IFAC, and also obviously connections through to other resource material. So that's really all I wanted to say to bring you up to date as to how IESBA itself and how is responding to the COVID crisis, and also to explain the support that we're trying to give the profession generally. And if any members of the CAG have thoughts or ideas as to how we can amplify or extend what we're doing, I'll be very, very interested to hear it. And I'll try and answer any questions that you may have, Galen. And I'll get rid of the share screen so that you can all see each other.
Thank you, Richard.
I hope that's...
I don't see any hands at the moment. That doesn't mean to say that there's not any we wouldn't have any feedback. Certainly, representatives should feel free to separately contact Richard with any emails with comments. I do see one, Paul Thompson. Paul, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I think this is very welcome that this support material is being made available, and it's great to see the collaboration with the NSS. Just a small remark, and that is, I do hope that the board and IFAC is doing all it can to make these documents readily accessible for the purpose of translation. You know, they're very useful, but it's very important that professional accountancy organisations and NSS can get their hands on the document and translate them in a timely fashion.
Thank you for that comment. This was an issue that we discussed at a recent meeting in relation to this, talking about how to promote what we're doing And I know that there was discussions with IFAC to take that forward. And James is nodding and probably can give more detail than me, but certainly we identified that and took it forward about a month ago as a specific issue, seeking to make sure that IFAC gave full prominence to it and any support that was required.
Thank you, Paul. Well, we have another update that we need to briefly hit on, and that's on the monitoring group's review, and a significant one at that. James Gunn has agreed to just give us a very brief update, and thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you, Galen. Hello, everyone. I will try and be brief, but cover the main points of what's happened and what's happening. As I'm sure all of you are aware, you've seen in July, the monitoring group released its final paper, setting out recommendations for strengthening the international auditing and ethics standard setting system. If you haven't, the paper and the related monitoring group press release is on the IOSCO website. And hopefully you'll also have seen the related joint IESB and IESBA press announcement, as well as IFAC's, both issued shortly after the release of the monitoring group paper, and both welcoming the completion of the reform review. Now, at a very high level, a few notable dimensions within the reform recommendations themselves. For the standard setting boards, a continuation of IESB and IESBA as separate boards within their existing remits, but with new multi-stakeholder composition envisioned, a slightly smaller, a 16-member, but bringing in a more inclusive approach to multi-stakeholder representation. Also a recommendation for them to have greater independence through being housed in a separate legal entity outside of IFAC. In regards to recommendations around oversight and the PIOB, among other enhancements, again, multi-stakeholder representation and open nominations into the PIOB, and the recommendation for the PIOB to have a more direct role in the standard setting board's nomination process. In regard to standard setting itself, a new public interest framework developed and issued in conjunction with the recommendations designed to help both the standard setting boards and the PIOB on public interest considerations and assessments. And finally, in relation to standard setting and input to the standard setting, a commitment to stakeholder advisory councils to the standard setting boards. Now, whether that is to be a simple continuation of the CAGs as we know them today, or some evolution of the CAGs and evolution of our liaison with the national standard setters. And I do anticipate we will take a refreshed look at the form and construct, but that's still to be determined. And the PIOB and the SSBs, and undoubtedly the existing incumbent CAG chairman, will be involved in considering options, alternative models, and finally any transition in terms of the role of the advisory groups to the standard setting boards. Now, the paper also announced, the paper and the related announcements also indicated what's going to happen next. And essentially that's over the next several months through the end of March 2021 would be the so-called transition planning phase. And that's an opportunity to look at all of the recommendations and chart a path forward through implementation. And the implementation phase following, subsequent to March of next year, for a period of about approximately 3 years to allow for a smooth change and implementation of the recommendations over a reasonable period. And believe me, the 3 years will go by very quickly to put the new board structures and arrangements into place. So what's happening now after release of the paper? Essentially, the monitoring group has reached out to the standard setting board chairman, the PIOB, IFAC, and requested, I suppose, their priority implementation lists and issues as each of them would see them. And as you can imagine, there's a fair list developing. You can imagine from the PIOB and the IFAC side, details around the structure and legal arrangements for the new entity surrounding the SSBs, the development of skills matrices for the PIOB and for the SSBs in order to implement the multi-stakeholder compositions, issues around transition of board compositions, how and when that takes place, form and remit of the compositions of the stakeholder advisory group. So each of the constituencies have put forward their implementation lists. The IESB and IESB chairs have sent in their lists in August, which included some brief consultations with their planning committees. And in that submission, both chairmen emphasized the importance of any transition planning that helps ensure that the two boards can complete their current strategies and work programs without disruption. And in the sense that idea is to put the new boards in their best possible position to establish new strategies and work programs, which is with as much completed projects and evidence base as possible. So really an emphasis on transition that allows the two boards to complete their current strategy and work programs. Now, finally, the monitoring group has the various lists now and likely their own list. And they've indicated that as a next step, they will be looking to convene again sometime in September to set out an overall plan of how they would like to see the transition planning and implementation phase play out. And they also indicated they'd like to consider how some smaller sized working groups could lead the drafting and development on select areas to help progress timely implementation and transition. So overall, I'd characterize it as it's a very promising, timely shift to transition. And that was very important after the completion of the final reviews. And we're seeing that, and that's very positive. And we're also seeing a very inclusive approach to leveraging the knowledge and the capabilities of IFAC, the standard setting boards, the PIOB, in contributing to transition and rollout. So having said that, I'd say let's not underestimate the amount of work and thinking that still is needed to be done over the next 9 months in terms of setting out a transition plan, and obviously the efforts that will be needed during the implementation phase. We did mention, or the chairman, the SSB chairmen did mention that regular communications and progress updates during this transition phase will likely, if not certainly, be of interest to most, if not all, stakeholders. And we would continue to encourage the monitoring group to keep stakeholders updated as transition progresses and implementation plans are firmed up. Galen, thank you very much. That's my very brief update for a very significant development, and happy to take any questions now or offline.
Thank you, James. Appreciate it. Thank you for that informative update on what's going on. I'm sure we'll be hearing again from you in the future on this important matter. We're running a little bit behind time. I don't want to take any of Sylvie's time. We've got her lined up here to give us an update on the objectivity of what is being called appropriate reviewers, which is part of the EQR standard that the board has been working on. So Sylvie, it's your time going forward here.
Thank you very much, Galen. I believe that we are putting our slide deck, yes, on the screen. I hope you can see it clearly, and if you can hear me also very, very clearly. So I think we have a little over 1 hour to go over that presentation and give you a full update, as well as taking some of your input. So it's a very full agenda that we have in front of us. So let me give you first an overview of the topics that we will be talking about. Carla, if you can just move. Yeah, so of course, we will spend some time looking at the response to the exposure draft, and obtain some input from you, your views, on the response and the revised proposal. But actually for that session, there will be more than just looking at the significant comments. Since we met last time, a lot happened on that project. So perhaps, Carla, we can move to the next slide and tell you, how we will really structure that session. So as I mentioned, we received the comment letters to the exposure draft questions. This is where we were when we met last time. And I will present to you the response to those 3 questions that we asked the commenters when we exposed the draft. I will present to you some summary analysis of the responses, giving you really an overview of and a sense of direction from the commenters. Having that knowledge, I think it would be then timely to report back on some of the points that you raised in the I think it was March, no, on the December session, your feedback and the question that you raised at the time. We have a better, I would say, informed knowledge having received the commenters' input. I will also update you on everything that was done and in particular presented and discussed at the June IESBA meeting. We presented really the response from the commenters, the way the task force intended to address it, and a first draft of the pronouncement. And I will even walk you through most of the proposed text that we will be presenting to the board next week. And I say most because there will be one section, which is the very last section of the text, that I will keep for the last part of our discussion. We received in July some additional feedback from the PIOB, raising a number of very valid questions. And I would like to present those questions to you, present to you also how the task force intends to address it and discuss it with the IESBA in September. And we will also ask you for some of your input and feedback on those questions. And then very clearly, what are our intended next steps. So you see, it's a very, very full agenda, and I will walk you through every step in that journey. So perhaps let's move on. So when we parted, I would say last time we were about to issue an exposure draft. Actually, the exposure draft was either already issued or about to be issued. And in our exposure draft, which was really putting together our intended response at the time to be helpful for the WSB, and in particular helping them in some of their issues that they were addressing in ISQM2 in relation to the qualification of the engagement quality reviewers. We had put together that ED, and we presented 3 questions in particular to the commenters, whether they were supporting the objective of making some changes in the code. We asked questions about the location that we were proposing at the time of that proposed guidance. And we also asked some question about whether we should have and where we should have a requirement that IWSB is expecting or was expecting at the time to introduce in ISQM2 in relation to a mandatory cooling off requirement in a very specific situation where an individual had been the audit engagement partner, and whether that individual could immediately move to become the EQR or not. And in particular, the view, and it was the view at the time, was that to maintain objectivity, it would be better to have a cooling off period and it was already proposed to be introduced in ISQM2. And we needed to make sure that the code would well support that position. And there were some questions whether since it is a requirement, whether it is better located in ISQM2 or in the code, or how should the interaction between the code and ISQM2, how that should be articulated. So those were really our 3 questions. So let me move on and give you the overall feedback. We had a pretty good response level, considering that it was a pretty narrow and short exposure draft. We received overall 38 responses, comment letters. And you know that when we say 38 comment letters, a number of those letters are coming from organizations that are representing multiple other organizations. So we were pretty pleased to have that level of feedback. And if we are looking at the diversity and representation of the response, you will see that geographically it was very well represented. And if you see also on the right side, we put together the background of all the responders. And it's a very also diverse background. So I think we were quite happy to say that the response that we received are really representing the views and the various views and also the trends of I would say most of our stakeholders. So it's a very good feedback that we received. Let's move on. So about the questions. So the first question was really about the general whether there would be general support of introducing new proposed guidance to address the topic of the objectivity of an EQR in the code. And a very supportive answer. 100% of the respondents were supporting that IESBA would introduce such a guidance to address objectivity and EQR in the code. So we have here the breakdown, but very, very consensual support. The second part was about, and I will take that as in relation at the ED as it was presented at the time. We presented the ED with the intent to have a pretty short text in the general section 120 of the code. And in general, we had some support for where we had put at the time our proposed text. We had a more limited number of people who were in disagreement and proposing some other location. However, on all who were agreeing, they were agreeing on the principle, but some also expressed that we are fine if you are putting it in section 120, but do not hesitate to consider location in other locations. And I wanted to highlight that because it was a point that was raised also by the CAG, and I will come back in our response to the CAG how we are handling the input from the commenters and the input from the CAG in our current draft. Let me move on to the next slide. So that's question number 3. This is where we received the most of, I would say, developed level of answer. So the question was really in relation to the possibility of a mandatory cooling off of 2 years in the specific situation where an individual is the audit engagement partner and intends to become the EQR. So whether there should be a cooling off requirement and where. So let me spend some time here about the analysis of the response, because it's a very key point that some of you addressed in the CAG meeting, and also that the PIOB also addressed in their comments more recently. So let's just want to have for you, all the facts. So on that question, whether there should be a cooling off requirement, we had, out of the 38 responses, we had 11 respondents who were not in agreement with having any type of cooling off requirement. As a reminder, the cooling off requirement was really also the position of IWSB. And they were very, I would say, for them, it's very important from a quality viewpoint to be able to introduce that mandatory cooling off period. So for us at the board, considering we are talking about the qualification of the EQR, and for us, those qualification criteria really sets by the IWSB. It was, I would say, important for us to know that there were 11, which is about almost 1/3 of the respondents who were opposing the cooling off requirement. However, knowing that cooling off requirement would be in IWSB, I mean, we acknowledge the opposition, but we will nevertheless move forward since we want to be as part of the coordination, supportive and helpful, and fully consistent with IESQM2. So let's look at the other, those who are in agreement with the cooling off period. So we are talking here about 27 respondents, and they were in agreement with the cooling off period. And if we look at their preference, and I would say that most of the respondents, they expressed a preference rather than an absolute view whether a cooling off period should be in IESQM2, whether in the IESBA code. 1/3, about 9 of them, said that their preference would be to have a cooling off period requirement in the code. And 2/3, so 18 of them, were very clear that they would prefer to have the cooling off requirement in IESQM2. So that's really what is coming from the comments that we received. So if I summarize, it was also debated and discussed between the two task forces, IESQM2 and the task force on EQR objectivity, and it was also debated by the two boards. As a result of the coordination and as a result of the further debates within the board, our view was that predominantly there was an expectation to have the requirements in IESQM2 and to keep in the code an approach which is more principle-based in relation to the introduction of a cooling off requirement. And that is what also we presented to the board, and where we had support by the two boards back in June. So that's really what I could say could come from the responses that were coming from the exposure draft. Here I think I will stop here. Can we move on to the next slide, Carla? Okay, so that's the more granular, I would say, analysis of that question 3. More or less, this is what I was just commenting right now. You will see a better split, of the origin of the comments and the views based on the background and of the commenters. So
Sylvie, I'm going to stop you right there and interject something, if you don't mind. One of the main significance of whether or not this guidance should be in the code or in the ICES or the IESQM2 is because some jurisdictions have adopted the code, but not the audit standards, and then the other way around as well. Some have adopted the audit standards, the ISIS and the IAASB guidance, and not the code. And so, not all jurisdictions have adopted both. So, I'll leave it at that and let you go forward.
Yeah. And this is really some of the points that we developed, and I will also keep developing in explaining, what would be our proposed approach and our position. We really consider the fact that you have uneven adoption level depending on jurisdictions. Absolutely.
One other thing that I might add, for our information, Josephine Jackson from the IAASB, the working group chair over there, has joined our session here. So wanted to welcome her. Thank you, Sylvie. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. I mean, I think it's important to highlight, because as I will be presenting some of our direction and response, it's important to keep all those elements in mind. I will move to the next slide, which is really like opening a little bit for the floor. You made a comment, Galen, but I would like to make sure, if there is any other question or comment based on the input we received from the comment letters. And those issues I will further discuss, but at least on the comments received, if there is any question, I'd be willing to take a question.
Any comments from the representatives on this, what Sylvia's gone over? James Dawkin.
Well, good morning.
Recognize you.
Thank you for that presentation, Sylvia. That was very helpful. Very interesting to see the feedback that you received. I think one comment that I have is in terms of the geographic location. I'm very supportive of having the cooling off period, but it does seem like it relates primarily to the quality standards which IESBA has been working on. And so to me, it seems like it probably should reside within that group rather than ethics.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jim. Actually, I will come back to you. I would say that at some point that was the view also of the two boards, but there are some challenges, pros and cons on that point. So, and it is something that I will try to explore a little bit more later. But I appreciate your position and your view. Yeah, thank you. Any other comment, or shall I move on?
Sylvie, is it on the quality management standards, will they, in terms of what they're talking about, will there be a specific cooling off period? I guess that's the thing that concerns me, is if firms adopt their own internal policies with respect to the EQR, could it be that they wouldn't adopt any specific cooling off period, or are they talking about a specific time off in the ISQM?
There ISQM2 has a specific, there's a prescriptive time off period.
Right. Okay.
And I will re-explain the articulation between actually ISQM1 and ISQM2 and the code, which is the result of our coordinated response. But yes, there will be a mandatory 2-year cooling off period for that very specific and narrow situation of moving from audit partner to EQR. Yes.
Well, is there any discussion about having the requirement in both the code as well as the ISQM?
There were discussion about that. If you bear with me a little bit, I will
okay. Right.
Why we go one way rather than another.
All right.
But yes, I intend to address that. On the other points, any question? Okay, so let's move on to the next set. So there were a number of points that were raised by the teleconference with the CAG in December, also before we issued our exposure draft. So I would like to address those points. So there were 3 points mainly that I would like to highlight that were raised by the CAG. First, the location of the proposed guidance in section 120. You remember it was one of the questions that we asked in the exposure draft, and most of the responses the people were saying, well, you know, if you put it in 120, we are fine. You might want to explore other possibilities. So initially in our exposure draft, we had put it in section 120, which is an overall section that is addressing normally every professional accountant situation. But there is a subsection in 120 that is more narrow to audit reviews and other assurance engagement. So we thought at the time that it was a good idea to put it there. However, the CAG, at the time, I mean, a number of your representatives of the CAG were saying, you know, perhaps we should really look at putting it in section 300, which is about professional accountants in public practice, or even in section 400, which is the independence section. So actually, we will do that. This is what we decided to do in our last June meeting, based on further analysis and some other feedback that we received from the comment letters. So in particular, and I will explain why, we are broadening the scope of what we are doing on the objectivity of the EQR. And you mentioned that now it's more about objectivity of what we call an appropriate reviewer, rather than just the EQR. And we think that it will make more sense to create a totally new section that will really address that objectivity issue in relation to appropriate reviewer and appropriate reviewer, including the EQR. So that's would directly respond, I would say, to the comment that we received from the CAG. And I will further discuss in the following slide. Just one comment. We are not putting anything in section 400. We are not talking about an independence issue here. It's not about independence. It's about the objectivity of the EQR or a broader group of individuals we call appropriate reviewers that may or may not be involved in audit matters. So we are not talking about independence. And even for the EQR, we're talking about objectivity in the context of quality management, not in the context of independence. So actually, we are not putting, I mean, it's not about independence. So for us, section 400 is not the most relevant one. So that's really 300 that ends up to be seen as the most relevant section. The other point that the CAG raised was about the determination of an effective date. Of course, it is very important to the extent that that pronouncement on objectivity of EQR or appropriate reviewer is there to support mostly the ISQ M2 standard. It is very important for us to have an alignment of the effective dates, and it was our intent from the very beginning. So we will be responsive here, and I will show you later our proposed timeline, including effective date. So those 2 points, I would say, we will really address directly. There was a third point, and we can move to the next one. About the cooling off requirement, mandatory, as you mentioned, Galen, but there were more comments about whether that should be mandatory for PIEs, public interest entity, as defined in the code. And it's a difficult question to answer because, as you know, today, the IESBA, they are not using the concept and definition of public interest entity the same way we are defining and using it in the code. And actually, we do have right now a task force with representatives of the, I mean, that is led by IESBA, but with representatives of the IWSB. And they are looking at a definition of public interest entity with the view perhaps in the next step, to have more coordination and alignment in the way we are looking at those concepts. But I think it's quite important to, if we're looking at that issue right now, to which type of entity a cooling off requirement might apply, it's important to look at what is intended, I would say, short term in the quality management standards. And the articulation is as it. ISQM1 establishes a requirement for certain audit engagement to have an engagement quality review. And the requirement to have such quality review is for listed entities and some other types of entities that are today identified as entities of significant public interest. And there is no alignment with those entities and what is today defined as a public interest entity in the code. And so really the full requirement and obligation, you would say, applies to listed entities. And there is still some element of judgments for additional entities. So for us, we consider that there is an EQR, mandatory EQR, only for entities defined under ISQM1. So we cannot mandate in the code an EQR from other entities. We cannot go beyond what is the remit of the IWSB. So we just follow what they are doing. And also the task force on PI might also help in the future. Then if we look at the other elements, we have ISQM2, which is setting the qualification requirement, the eligibility of an EQR. And this is where they refer to the objectivity of the EQR in the context of quality management activities. And they are setting those requirements for eligibility. This is where they will also include the cooling off period. Because for them, they expect firms to establish policies and procedures to have that mandatory 2-year cooling off period as one of the actions to safeguard threats to objectivity of the EQR in the scenario that I was mentioning. So this is what we are, I would say this is our basis for us to consider, and this is really the direction of ISQM1 and ISQM2 as they are right now being intended to be approved in the coming months. And that's really our background. So for us, we cannot go beyond those boundaries. However, what we intend to do is really to make sure that the code is there supportive and could be leveraged to facilitate and make clearer all the pronouncements that will be in ISQM1 and in ISQM2. So it's a long explanation to explain why we cannot introduce a mandatory cooling off requirement for PI, because we depend on the full framework that is set by ISQM1 and ISQM2. So perhaps I will stop here to make sure that I have been clear, and because it was important, it was raised by the CAG, and you may want to challenge or ask for further clarification.
So any comments or questions of Sylvie from the representatives? Well, Sylvia, it seems pretty clear.
Okay, thank you. I will come back to some of those points later on when I will explain, the drafting and our direction anyway. But at least I wanted to give you on principle, the rationale, so you understand our thought process. So let's move on to the next one. So, okay. So now let's talk about, where we are going now. In particular, we spent, of course, some time with the board, presenting what I just presented to you, and some of the views from the task force, how to be responsive and what should be the final pronouncements. And there were really three topics that were discussed mainly during the June meeting. That issue of location of cooling off requirement. So I will tell you about what was really the direction provided by the board. A pretty important element that is also helping us to relocate the provision in section 300. We thought that, and based also on the comments we received, that just talking about EQR was pretty narrow, and that a lot of the guidance that we intend to provide could make some sense to be used in a broader scope situation. And as a consequence of the 1 and 2 point, the decision to create a new section in 300, which is section 325. So let's move on to the next slide. So, and that's really a follow-up of what we were just discussing. The input from the board was very clear that really when you have an engagement quality review, it is under ISQM1, as I just explained. The separation of the individual's previous involvement from new involvement, it's clearly also an objectivity issue and an ethical issue. But there was also some views that on objectivity, the situation of an individual moving from a role to another may not be the only objectivity threat that could happen. And the board was also of the view that just saying that, for objectivity, you have one single safeguard or action, which would be the cooling off requirement, may not be sufficient to address every possibility or situation where objectivity would be threatened. And the firm might determine, or the code might determine, that there could be some other types of responses in other types of situations when there are risks or threats to objectivity. So considering the feedback from the board, the proposal of the task force, and that's the way we are putting our draft together, and where how we are addressing it when we will be presenting to the board, is that consistent with what we had said actually in the exposure draft, and when we had already obtained some support, the code will continue to retain a principle-based approach, which would allow to not only address the narrow scenario of one individual moving from one role to another, but any type of objectivity threat that could happen to EQR or equivalent roles. In addition to that, since we were coordinating with the IWSB and we knew already that ISQM2 was here to set a mandatory cooling off requirement, the board and the task force was content that considering that the issue would be clearly and comprehensively addressed. So that was more or less the direction of the board and further work by the task force. I will go to the two other points. So Carla, if you can move on. Okay. The other, I would say, pretty important outcome that was, of course, coming from the proposal and work of the task force, but also from the discussion with the board and a number of comments that we received and suggestions that we received in the comment letter. Our position would be that it may not be sufficient to just to look at objectivity in a very narrow way for the EQR in a very narrow situation. A lot of the points that were put together in our exposure draft could be relevant in broader situation than only quality reviewer. In particular, the code already uses the concept of what we call an appropriate reviewer. And it is a defined term actually in the code. And in the code, an EQR is already an example of an appropriate reviewer. So we were saying that rather than being very narrow, since we are principle-based, since we are reinstating very important guidance in relation to how to address threats to objectivity to those reviewers, why don't we are just more straightforward and really create the section not only on EQR, but on appropriate reviewer in general, so we can be comprehensive. And we can look at or highlight any type of threats. And those threats, actually, many of those principles and elements were already in the code, but in various areas. So we have now something that is more complete, you know, and at the same place. And this is what we intend to recreate a dedicated section. To go back also on that appropriate reviewer concept, it has been already developed during the Safeguard project a couple of years ago. And it was already at the time based on the extant ISQC1. So we were shaping the concept of appropriate reviewer on what we knew was at the time the AQCR, as it was called. It's really broad and principle based, the way we are looking at the threats and the issue. So it's really based on our conceptual framework. As defined, it could include individuals from within or outside the firm. I am mentioning that because in relation to what Richard Fleck presented before, you know, about specialists from outside the firm, that it brings some very relevant guidance and considerations on objectivity of those individuals, for instance. And the code is also very clear on a number of actions and safeguards that are very, very relevant here. So we are creating a new section that will be applicable to the EQR, but that has a lot of very helpful material for those appropriate reviewers and threats to their objectivity in general. So that's what our proposal was, to broaden the scope, and we had the support of the board in June. Let me move to the number 3. So actually we received, when we proposed that broadening, some interesting feedback from the IESBA. They were agreeing that certain attributes of the appropriate reviewer are not equally being addressed, and that's true. We are mostly focusing on the objectivity, but that was a point that was made. We had developed some material and analysis on various examples of threats. So the board gave us additional input. They gave us some additional wording suggestions to have a better drafting. And we had also a discussion whether the fact that we would be broadening our scope based on the exposure draft of that we had, whether that would require a re-exposure. And actually, this is a point that we will be discussing with the board in the coming weeks. Today, and I would like to address that, the task force looking at the content of what we are putting on the table for appropriate reviewers, including EQR, our view is that we don't think there would be a need to re-expose. We believe that all the guidance that we are putting together in one single convenient location are based on existing concepts and definition. The guidance is also assembled from existing provisions, but they are just put together in one location. The topic was already deliberated by the board actually in prior meetings, and there were some suggestions to broaden that section. So it's not something totally new that we're introducing. And in addition, and I think that one is very important, that we have a number of commenters that were making the suggestion to broaden what we were writing and drafting from EQR to a more open and comprehensive situation. And we believe that those changes and the way what we're doing is indeed a way to be more responsive to the comments that we receive, and not introducing something totally new. On the contrary, it is following some of the suggestions that we are making and being fully consistent with the thought process that we have had together. But that was raised by the board, and we intend to discuss with the board and see, of course, their input. But pretty important topic to mention, because the re-exposure issue is quite important in our time. Let me move on to the last point. So as I was explaining, we intend to create, we propose to create a new section, the section 325, to really cover the objectivity of appropriate reviewers. So that's broadening the scope of the guidance, as I explained. We thought that it would better to have a dedicated section that have it in the general introduction of section 300, looking at what we have already in 300. And in 300, we have a number of subsections that have already a certain structure that was very suitable for us to address that topic. And it will help us put more content and more meat on the concept of appropriate review also in general, which is, I would say, scattered over the code. We have in the extant code that concept, and we use that for instance, using appropriate reviewers as a safeguard. So it is in the code. Using appropriate reviewers such as EQR to meet a quality management objective under ISQM1, they are there, or also some other applicable quality framework. So the code does refer to all those roles in various locations, and for us it's pretty good, to have it in one location and address it in a whole holistic manner. So that's really the 3 points that were discussed by the board. Let's move on, Carla. So to clarify, how we wanted to draft that section 325. So overall, the text is consistent with the exposure draft content. It's more or less the same text, slightly reshuffled to follow the structure drafting convention. But most of the text is the same that was in the exposure draft. It is principle-based. That was really our approach as also a result of coordination. And it follows very strictly our conceptual framework. It is written in a way to mirror the drafting structure in other subsection of 300, 310 to 360. And we, of course, included some additional minor amendments to reflect more comments and suggestions from the respondents. This is really what we have in front of us. I have two possibilities. I can pause here to take some comments, or give you a quick walkthrough through the section 325, which is a very short section. So perhaps I might pause here, and then I will give the walkthrough.
Any comments from members? And Sylvia, we're going to extend our time a little bit, but we'd like to finish up at 9:40 Eastern, so about 20 minutes.
We're good, I think.
So James Dawkin has a question or a comment.
Thank you, Sylvia, or thank you, Galen. Sylvia, I have a comment and maybe a question. My comment is based on some experiences I have in dealing with similar issues about this objective reviewer. I've found we've tried to be principle based, but some folks are very creative in terms of how they define what a objective reviewer is, and even have it proposing people that have a role in the engagement. So I do think you need some guardrails in general to make sure that it's really objective. But my second is more of a question, and that really relates to what you were talking about earlier. And here in section 325, you'd have more or less the guidepost for a reviewer. But then if this resides within the IEESB standard, will people have to go back and forth between the two standards to determine whether they're objective reviewer or not? And will that create confusion, or am I just off base in asking that question? So that's my comment. Thank you.
Okay. I would suggest to answer your comment, perhaps I will go through the walkthrough because I hope that I will be able to show you some element of response already. I think that would be easier. But before we do that, do we have any other comment of question, Galen?
Yes, I'd like to recognize Megan Zeitzman from PCAOB.
Yeah.
Hi, Galen. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Sylvie. So maybe just before I kick off, I just need to give my disclaimer that my remarks today are my own and not those of the board or anyone, any individual member or the staff or what have you. So thanks, Sylvie, for the explanation. And maybe my comments and questions are a little bit similar to Jim's. It seemed to me as I read this, it was quite a shift from what started as maybe a little bit more of a targeted project, and now being broadened into this concept of an appropriate reviewer, which just made me wonder a little bit about, are there some unintended consequences? And maybe Jim kind of framed up the question, when you think about this relative to how things work on the IEESB side of things. I mean, just I kind of worry. I don't have anything specific to point to, but I'm just wondering, is there anything that's going to not be clear or that's going to slip through the cracks? So one example, I think, where I did have a question was when I was looking in the issues paper. I think it's in paragraph 11. It talks about the concept of reviews within an engagement team, and talks about ISO 220 dealing with that. So that's quality management at the engagement level, that talks about the concept of reviews of work being done by other members of the team who have more experience. And then, when I came across, and I recognize you're still going to do the detailed walkthrough of this content, but when I got to the actual piece that I was reading here, it wasn't quite clear to me whether the concept of an appropriate reviewer is picking up people that are within an engagement team, or is it just the concept of somebody outside of the engagement team who's doing some kind of a review, be that an engagement quality review or some other kind of I guess review that maybe it's an in-process review or something like that. And it was those kinds of questions that came to mind as I was reading all of this. And maybe it's all clear and worked out, but to me it just seemed like maybe it was going to raise some questions.
Okay, thank you, Megan. I think I will address together with Jim's comment.
Before we have a couple other comments to Sylvie. Shigeo Kashwagi, our PIOB representative, he wanted to say something.
Yeah, I did want to say something about the location issue and the appropriate reviewer, but I understand that you are going to talk about the PIOB's comments later on, and I would like to listen to the CAG representatives' views on our views. So I'm conscious about the time. I hope I will have enough time later on to have engaged in discussions on this issue. I just wanted to say at this point here.
Okay, Thank you.
Sylvia, we have two others, but if you'd like to, go back to Megan and
I would probably go back to Megan's and Jim's comment, and I to help me, I think I will move to the next slide, which is because I think it's easier if I show you, how we intend to respond to it in our draft. Well, very quickly, the way we are updating the proposed text, it's not in that one, it's the next one. But just to tell you, at least I will have addressed that. The section 225, as I explained, really mirrors some of the other sections. We do explain the expansion of scope and the link to quality management. As I mentioned, when we look at appropriate reviewer, it is already in the code used in two situations, and it is already in the code. For instance, when you use an appropriate reviewer as a safeguard to look at certain issues, or we refer to EQR under IESQM1. And we gave those two examples to clarify some of the background and context where we are using the concept of appropriate reviewers. But what is important, I guess, is the next slide, which defines appropriate reviewer. It is a defined term already in the code. So we are not creating anything new or any new definition at all. It is in the extant section 12014, and we are almost changing nothing except putting at the end that an EQR appointed under IESQM2 is an example of appropriate reviewer. And again, it is not something new that we are introducing in the code, because we have a number of areas in the code, particularly in the independent section, I have to say, where we say to address, for instance, that threat or that situation, you may want, or you shall have, the appointment of an individual with a role equivalent to an EQR. So we are not introducing anything new. We have already a defined term of what is an appropriate reviewer, and we already have in the code a number of areas when we say that an EQR is a kind of appropriate reviewer for certain types of purposes. So I think it's pretty important to highlight this is not something new, but it is defined. And to clarify your point, Megan, we're not saying that appropriate reviewer means any type of review, like you have a senior staff member reviewing the work of a junior staff member. That's not the way we are looking at it. What we call appropriate reviewer is there is a review with a certain purpose, like quality management, like helping, in managing an independence issue and looking at, as a safeguard, or reviewing the to mitigate the existence of certain threats, for instance, self-review or familiarity.
Sylvia, if I can interject, Takashi Harai wanted to make a comment. I wanted to make sure we got him in as well, unless you had anything else there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Takashi, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Garen. Thank you, Sylvie, for the presentation. Sorry, I have same comment on the Megan and Jim already mentioned. The agenda item B1, paragraph 11, second bullet point. Sorry, again, this comment, but my understanding is, paragraph 11, second bullet point state the more experienced staff members who review the work performed by the other staff within the same engagement also considered to be the appropriate reviewer in the proposed section 325. And as you explained before, the concept of the appropriate reviewer is originated as a safeguard in the code. So I am same as Megan, I'm little concerned about introducing this concept of the concept of objectivity of the appropriate reviewer into the case of within the same engagement. For example, relationship between the staff and the manager on the audit engagement. This may cause the confusion in the practice or cannot ensure the consistent application of the code, I think. So if the board want to expand the scope of the appropriate reviewer, just my idea that so agenda item B1 paragraph 13, the task force proposed to this explanation indicated the basic for the conclusion, but I think it is more useful to clearly state in the code, for example, paragraph 3, 20.4A1 states the engagement quality reviewer is one of the example appropriate reviewer. So the other example, the appropriate reviewer explained the agenda item B1 paragraph 11 also should be included in the code itself. I believe that the clear linkage between the code and the audit standard, for example, ISO 220, would help to improve the understandability of the not only the audit standard, but also the code. So I have same concern as Megan already mentioned, this expanded to the concept to the appropriate reviewer to the within the same engagement. So thank you.
I would like to highlight one point in what you say. Very often, particularly you were referring to some of the independence provision. I would say that if you look at the code, when we are referring to using an appropriate reviewer to review whether the audit or a non-assurance engagement, we're very specific, and we talk about an appropriate reviewer who is not a member of the audit team to help, in particular to address independent safeguards, etc. So we are pretty specific in a number of situations to clarify that in relation to the independence part, we expect to have the appropriate reviewer not being a member of the audit team. But we also acknowledge that there could be some other situations, because we are not only talking about audits or assurance here. It is a section that is applicable to the entire range of activities of professional accountants. So sometimes there is no need to be independent. But we are talking about other types of review, for instance, in relation to conflict of interests, etc. And this is why we believe our definition of appropriate reviewer, referring to objectivity and referring to specific skills, etc., it's broader. So it's a very broad concept, but it doesn't mean necessarily any review. And it doesn't mean necessarily that within the same team, it's always okay or not okay. There are some consideration and also judgment about what is really appropriate for the specific purpose of that review. So, and again, as I am explaining, it is not something new. It is already in the code, but the way it is in the code today is more scattered over a number of provisions. But we will take your point, Takeshi, and we will, and particularly also the risk of unintended consequence, and we will make sure, look at it again and have with the board to see that the draft will be clear about that.
Thank you, Sylvie. We have a couple other one other comment. Naomi Robert wanted to comment, and Naomi, we're really running short on time, so if you can try to keep it brief.
Thank you, Chairman. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, I will be quick, but I just to emphasize Megan's point about maybe unintended consequences here, because it looks to me that we are using a concept that were used in the code, but for something else, or to broaden or to encapsulate something to very we wanted to cover the objectivity of the EQR, and now we are using a concept that was much more broadened to something else here. So it may be we may not have we may create some interaction that are not that we don't realize yet. And it's a bit surprising at this stage of the project. I feel like we are focusing a lot on the objectivity of the appropriate reviewer, where actually the appropriate reviewer had also other attributes and not only the objectivity. So aren't we focusing too much on the objectivity? And I would be interested to know who in the respondents suggested to broaden the scope and encapsulate the appropriate reviewer. I don't, because I think that you mentioned that this was suggested. That would be, I think, interesting to know the background.
There is one, I think this is the UKFRC is one of them. Carla, I don't remember. There are some other. I remember UKFRC. Oh, is it AICPA also? I believe
it is the ICPA.
Yeah, ICPA, and there were some. Yeah, so those are the two that top of my head, that are coming at least very, very explicit about that approach, and that was also well discussed, with others.
Sylvie, again, because of time, is there a way?
Move on, if you...
Can we get to the PIOB questions pretty soon?
Let's move on directly to the PIOB points. So we have a few more. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So last July, after the discussion with the board, etc., we received also some feedback from the PIOB, and the feedback came in two ways. There was a letter, a written material from the PIOB that gave us some feedback, and there was also some verbal feedback that was provided to James, if I remember, and also Stavros. You had some discussion with the PIOB, and the PIOB had 3 points in particular they wanted us to look at. They had a point about how should interaction of cooling off period for EQR objectivity, how does that interact with the cooling off in long association provision? So we will be responding to that. There were pretty strong expectation that if there is a cooling off requirement of 2 years in the scenario that I mentioned, changing of role, it should be explicit in the code. And also there are expected some additional coordination between IESBA and IESBA in relation to the scope of application of such a cooling off requirement. So really those 3 points were raised by the PIOB. But I would say that the stronger point is the code should have a mandatory requirement of a 2-year cooling off period for the EQR, and that should be in the code. We consider those points, the task force, and also we discussed that with the planning committee of the IESBA to understand how that works with our current development of the project. Since we had been working with the PIOB alongside from the very beginning on every steps, and the position of the POB, I would say, is stronger today than, or clearer, I would say, that it was perhaps a few months ago. And we are, of course, considering, how we could be very responsive to the comments made by the POB, but still in line with first the comments that we received and the coordination process that we had with IESB and the instruction that we received from the board. So let me move to some of the elements of the analysis that the task force had put together and that we intend to discuss with our board. So we looked at all the feedback and the comments from the PIOB, and we were looking at the pros and cons on some of the suggestions that were made by the PIOB. So PIOB were saying that if you have a mandatory requirement on that role in the code, it will give a perception that the code is stronger. There is also the issue, and this is something, Galen, I think you mentioned about those jurisdictions that are adopting one set but not the other. And they were talking also about having all cooling off requirements in one place. That is also, I guess, in relation to the independence requirements. So we were looking at those points where there are pretty strong, good rationale, from the PIOB. But we were also looking, at what could be the consequence. And first, something is that in the exposure draft it was only principable. There was no requirement put forward together in our exposure draft that we put in a few months ago. And actually, the way we presented to everyone the articulation between IESQM1, IESQM2, and the code in relation to the cooling off period was, and that was at the time agreed was by the IESB, was really the direction that the requirement, because it relates to quality management, was expected to be in IESQM2, and IESQM2 is already written and drafted that way. And the code was intended, and that was the direction we were given at the time that we presented at the time in the exposure draft and was supported by the board. The code was to stay principle-based and put all the, I would say, the background for IESQM2 to leverage that in the context of quality management. So there is an articulation in a certain way, and creating a duplication might make things more complicated, because we would have to put a lot more content to duplicate, I would say, what is in IESQM2, to put it in the code and put it in the code in a way that is consistent with the code. Some of the other points also that were raised, and it's also in the concept of broadening to, I would say, appropriate reviewer, or I would say alternative situation even of quality reviews, where there is a quality review and an audit, but they don't necessarily meet all the requirement to be an EQR under the ISAs, which could happen, for instance, when they're in some audit, like more as a transition between they are in a position to have the full EQR review. They are starting to have some review, identify some reviewers. So they are doing, I would say, half the journey to the steps of meeting entirely the ISA. And there are some concern about that. Is the cooling off, mandatory cooling off of 2 years, could that constitute at some point, or for certain, some kind of a default response to any threat to objectivity? And in particular, since we wanted to have the code more broadened and look at other situations where objectivity is threatened, we were worried that if it is seen as the only default response, we might miss the response to other threats to objectivity. and our text is clear because it gives a number of scenarios examples that are different than the self-review thread that is addressed by the cooling off period. The other concern that our cons that we have was the emphasis on cooling off of the EQR are being the only focus element over the objectivity of appropriate reviewer in general. You understand now that we wanted to have a broader situation and be able to have a more holistic approach and provide more content and support and robustness to that concept of objectivity with various scenarios. And one of the cons would be, are we too narrow for just quality matters of the EQR? So those are I would say that the few things that were put on will be put on the table for the board to debate and for you to give input. But before I reopen, let me move exactly to where we are. Next slide, very quickly, Carla. The way we intend to address it we would like to address it in our code is not putting a requirement in the code, but having very, very clear cross-reference between the code and between what is in IESQM2. And explaining that in a certain type of situation, there is a safeguard that as an example of safeguard, which is the cooling off period for a period of sufficient duration. So this is putting together a principle that could be applicable. And then we put a very clear cross-reference to the specific situation of IESQM2 and clarifying, or I would say paraphrasing, the cooling off period from in IESQM2. So that's our proposal, to make sure that without being too restrictive, too narrow, and making sure we address everything, we still have very clear cross-reference and linkage on cooling off period requirement between the code and IESQM2. So that's our proposed direction that we would like to put on the table and that we will also discuss with the board. And here I will stop and take your comments, or perhaps share your comments.
Yes, Shago, you wanted to follow up?
Thank you. Yeah. I'm concerned about the time as well, but I'll try my best to be short. Well, thank you very much for the explanations. And can you show slide number 26? As Sylvie mentioned, we raised 3 issues. Let me briefly explain. I don't want to repeat the whole discussion, but the point I want to make here is that we are I am very much interested because we want to know what is in the public interest. And I need to convey to my PIB colleagues who will be observing the IESBA meeting next week. So learning what the public stakeholders think about this is very important. On the first point, we were very much concerned that there will be 2 cooling offs, and there could be a lot of confusion and complications. And that's why we mentioned that there should be some explanation to that effect. And the response we got from the task force is that you're going to write something about in the basis for conclusion and FAQ, frequently asked questions. That is not a authoritative guidance, and we wonder whether that is enough. And in that sense, I am interested in listening to the CAG represent this view. We think having clarity in avoiding ambiguity in the 2 sort of cooling offs is important, and something explicit should be written in the code. And on the second point, the location of the cooling off requirement, I understand there was a long discussion on this issue. yes, you want to keep the principle-based code, but we have had a sort of a precedent of long association. But the concern we have is, can you show slide 28? If you read the sentence in the A2, what it says is that, as Sylvie just mentioned, it's not a requirement. It's just cooling off is an example of possible safeguard. And I think it is, in a sense, very weak. It's simply not enough. And I think this is because we think that applying safeguards to address threats to objectivity are ethical matters. And I think the code should have a more explicit requirement in the code. But again, I know that there are different views, even among stakeholders, and I'm interested in listening to the other people's view. But if I may add one more, still looking at this page, if you look at the very last sentence of A2, I wonder that the current wording in this paragraph makes it clear, does not make it clear that cooling off does not apply to an individual who is appointed as an appropriate reviewer, but not a EQR. The first part of this paragraph is talking about appropriate reviewer. But as Sylvie mentioned, this is the cross-reference. So the second sentence is talking about engagement quality reviewer. So if you have a person who is an appropriate reviewer, but not an EQR, are you sure? I'm not sure. I don't know. Is the cooling off going to be required to this person who is the appropriate reviewer but not an EQR? So I think there's a lot of ambiguity. On the third point on page 26 about IESBA and IESBA coordination, I don't have any more points about it. I think that's more or less okay. But the major concern I have is what was not written in this is the, and I'm sure you're going to talk about this later on, but whether you are going to have a re-exposure or not. I think it is a very big issue. And as some of us have already mentioned, the broadening of the scope of the project is, I think it's a very big issue. And whether you need a re-exposure or not is an issue that we are interested in. And again, in that sense, we want to listen to the CAG representatives. And I think that will be a topic for discussion at the IESBA next week. But as an input for the IESBA meeting, I am interested in getting the views from the CAG representatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, CEO. So we're going to go to the hour on this. So about 8 more minutes. Other comments from representatives? And Stavros, did you have anything that you wanted to say?
Thank you, Galen. I'd rather, as Shigeo suggests, listen to the comments on you and get some guidance from the CAG. I would only ask people to be brief if possible, because I see that the time is very pressing.
Well, I certainly don't want to waste that time. So somebody else was.
Yes, I'm sorry. It's Natasha here. I'm afraid I can't find the raised hand.
Okay. Natasha will recognize you.
So it's Natasha Nandamel. I've been busy sending people sort of private chats to find out how to do it. But yeah, if I may very briefly, and I understand that we're pressed for time, I'm afraid I joined a little bit late, but I just wanted to support the comments that have been made by the PIOB. I think they're absolutely right. I have to say, looking at the breadth of responses, it disappoints me yet again that investors don't feature at all, as far as I can see. And in the end, it's really that community that is the recipient of these audit services. And when I look at this issue of objectivity, it's absolutely top of the agenda for many investors. And excuse me, and I think the level of protection here seems very weak to me. I think setting some kind of safeguard minimum cooling off seems absolutely reasonable, and I feel like 2 years is very short. I would seek, something that was a bit tougher than that, that absolutely ensured that there was no sense of influence or undue bias in that kind of review process. It's often not even whether there is, it's whether there's a perception of that really matters. To go as far, and I would even go as far as wanting, I know this will be totally out of the ballpark, but somebody external to that firm entirely undertaking a review process to ensure that level of objectivity is attained. So I realize this comes quite left field given the center of gravity of this discussion, but I do think that may reflect indeed the lack of investor input into these discussions. Thank you.
Thanks, Natasha.
Galen, it's Paul Munter. If I'm like Natasha, I can't figure out the raise hand button either, so my apologies. Let me first observe real quickly, as Galen said, I'm a representative of IOSCO, but I'm also an employee of the US SEC, and these are my own comments, don't represent those of the commission or other members of the staff. With respect to some of the concerns that Shigeo was expressing, I think that gets back in part to the observations that Takeshi and Megan were making about having broadened this to appropriate reviewers. And when I think about it from the lens of what an EQR is doing and the purpose of having an EQR in place with respect to a specific engagement, that has a particular purpose associated with it. And I think there, not only do you want somebody who is objective in terms of the fact, the mental state, but the appearance also is a critical element of it, which is why I think cooling off becomes a very logical way to think about it, and why ISQM2 is probably proceeding in that fashion. But when I think about other appropriate review functions beyond an EQR, the appearance of objectivity from an outside stakeholder perspective may not be as relevant to that assessment, since it may oftentimes be more internally focused to the audit firm itself and its own methodology and continuous improvement processes. So I think in evaluating this question of whether there should be explicit language about cooling off period in the code, to me, it comes down to a question of whether the code itself should stay broad about appropriate reviewers, thereby sweeping in EQRs and other reviews, or it should be narrow. And to the extent it stays broad, then I think it's going to have to be very clear as to where there might be different thought processes that are necessary for an EQR review that are not necessarily needed for other appropriate reviews. Thank you.
All right, we have a couple other commenters, so let's try to get them in here. Meng Wei from World Federation Exchanges.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks, Galen.
Yeah, and if we can try to really keep it brief, please.
Okay, I will try. I would like to see supports the idea to explicitly include the cooling off requirements in the code. but given the stringent time frame, it will be possible. The public interest will be better served for the code and the ISQM to implement at coordinated pace. So maybe better to include that in the future revision of the code. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei. And then Stavros, you had a comment.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I wanted to make a small comment relative to all the remarks I heard, namely that the primary question here is not the location of the cooling off requirement, but rather whether we should have it both in the code and in the IESBA. And I sort of agree with what Paul just said, that you may have some sort of division of labor between what the IESBA attempts and the code attempts to do. But I think these are very useful comments. My question would be, really, whether there is any additional public interest to be gained from the position where we have the cooling off requirement in the ISQM, and then we duplicate this in the code. Isn't the public interest sufficiently served from the cooling off requirement that's in the quality standard? To me, to my mind, that would be the issue that I would like to put on the table for our board discussion. But I just wanted to tell the CAG representatives that there is this question, and duplication, to my mind, also have a sort of philosophical concern about duplication between two sets of standards that are supposed to be coordinating together. Duplication is, in a certain sense, how shall I say it so, an avoidance of effective coordination. You know, when we were doing the restructuring code, parsimony and the avoidance of duplication was very, very important within the code, within various parts of the code. So here we're talking about something that may lead to exactly the same standard. The problem of scope was set out, but exactly the same standard in both sets of standards, and that may be a dangerous precedent too. So I just wanted to share my thoughts. Given where we are now, given that there is an IESBA task force decision to go ahead with including this cooling off requirement in the IESBA too. That's all.
Thank you, Stavros. Sylvia, we're out of time, but do you have any final word that you wanted to get in?
No. I think it was very helpful. I particularly appreciate Paul's explanation. I think, Paul, you really got, what were our intent, and I think we will try to be more explicit about the differentiation of the various reviewer thing, because I think that's one of the issues. We don't want that people reading the code would necessarily understand that every time there is an expectation of objectivity and a review, then you need a cooling off, because it's not that way. For DEQR and the specific role of DEQR, absolutely, and this is why we are following IESQM2. But I think that we were thinking that in other reviews, and Paul was very clear to provide some examples, I think that would not necessarily be relevant, or not even necessarily be the appropriate safeguard to address other types of objectivity issues that we had been putting as examples and scenario. So I think I would like to work and follow up on the articulation that Paul was putting together, because that was really the issue for us that we wanted to address here.
Thank you, Sylvia. All right, folks, this is, I apologize for going over. I'm sorry. Ken, go ahead. Go ahead, Ken.
Yes, Galen,
Yeah.
thank you. And not
Yeah.
to prolong the discussion, but I think it's very important. I just want to reemphasize the comment that Stavros has just made, which is that CAG representatives need to be conscious that the issue that we are addressing here is not whether there should be cooling off requirement. That is not the issue. The issue is whether there should be a duplication of the requirement in the two sets of standards. And related to that, in the slides where we set out the pros and the cons, I just want to, one of the pros was an argument along the lines of, well, some jurisdictions might adopt the code, but not the IESBA standards. In fact, we'd be hard pressed to identify a jurisdiction that that is in that camp, that they only adopt the code, but not IESBA standards. By far, if we were to look at the landscape of adopters of IESBA standards and adopters of the code, there's a greater number of jurisdictions that adopt the IESBA standards en bloc as a whole than the code. So it's we would be, it would be a very difficult task about actually identifying a jurisdiction that would be in that position. And that is what we've been trying to do. In fact, both set of standards are now very, very tightly interlinked. There are a number of requirements in the in the IESBA standards that are not carried across to the code. To give you some examples, the requirements in the quality management standards for the firm to assign appropriate resources for the engagement, that is not repeated in the code. And that is an important matter in respect of various matters of independence from the code's perspective. For example, in relation to amount of fees, there are no repetition of documentation requirements in the code, given that they're already in the auditing standards. There's materiality, etc., that again appear in the IESBA standards, but are not reported in the code. And that what I'm saying is basically what Stavros has been advocating, which is really to integrate the two standards better and avoid duplicating material.
Thank you, Ken. And with that, as I said, this is complicated stuff, but your input is very valued. We need to take our break now, and why don't we reconvene at 8:15? That's going to shorten what's available for the speakers that are coming on, but we need to break now. So why don't we return 15 minutes after the hour? Thank you. Say, Paul, if you're there, since you wasn't sure how to raise your hand, if you go to the bottom of the Zoom screen, there's a number of icons, participants, chat, share screen, record, reactions. Do you see that?
I see all of those, yes.
Okay, if you click on participants, you see participants? You should, okay, you over on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll get all of the people that are listed there, and you can raise your hand or not.
Got it.
And then,
okay, great.
And then when you want to take it back down, you hit raise hand again, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's how it works.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much.
I think the raise hand function will also work off of your space bar, or at least I've been told that.
Okay. Very good. Very helpful. Thanks, Galen.
What's happening, Galen? Everybody's taking a long break, huh?
Yeah, I'm afraid that's the case.
Yeah.
This happens.
Well, we extended, I think the previous discussion expanded the time for people who want to get a glass of water or something.
Well, I think it was a good discussion.
Oh, it was a great discussion. It was a great discussion, a lot of food for thought.
Right. I'm seeing people slowly come back from this abbreviated break. We'll wait a second or two. Brian, we'll see if we can give you as much time as we possibly can. We know that your presentation is important. For those that are joining us, I just talked to Jeff Kwan, and we're going to probably need to go over on the technology session. So we're going to plan on going 20 minutes or 20 minutes beyond the hour that we were planning on. So for those Eastern Standard Time, and I can't go over all your time zones, that'll make it 11:20.
But those in Asia, it means very, very late.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the case, and apologize for that. But anyway, wanted to recognize Brian Friedrich. He's going to take us through his important presentation on technology. Would also like to recognize Bob Dorr, a board member from the IAASB, who heads up their technology task force. So welcome, Bob. So Brian, it's all yours, buddy.
Thanks so much, Galen. Just wait for the slides to pop up. There we go. Excellent. So yeah, good day, everyone. It's a great pleasure to present to you today. Just before I get into the material, I wanted to acknowledge my colleagues on the Tech Task Force, James Barber, Greg Driscoll, Hiro Fukukawa, and Miriam Madden. And most of us were also part of the Phase 1 Tech Working Group, so we've got some solid continuity within this initiative. Melissa Bonsall is our IAASB correspondent member, and on the staff side, we're ably supported by Misha Peters, who's generously been seconded from the New Zealand XRB, in addition to IESBA's newest staff member, Cam Leung, who's kindly changing slides for me today. And then tech advisors, Laura Friedrich and Ellen Goria, are also helping out on the project. And then finally, I also wanted to acknowledge and appreciate IAASB's Tech Group Chair, Bob Dorr, who's observing the session. So next slide, please. So our objectives today are to report back on our last discussion in March, as was included in the cover note, and also to bring you up to date on the work of our task force since then. Next slide. Okay, so just a bit of background to set the context here. You'll recall that the Tech Working Group tabled its Phase 1 final report in December at the IESBA meeting, which led to an approved project plan in March of this year. And then in terms of timeline, we've been working through all of the recommendations somewhat in parallel and have preliminary views on each of them at this point, some that are further along than others. Our focus in Q4 is going to be on outreach to test our ideas. Obviously, this is one of those sessions. And then in Q1 of next year, we'll turn our minds to more precise drafting, which will be taking a very principles-based approach to ensure that we're able to encompass as broad a set of technology and innovation and so on that we can with any of the changes that are suggested to the code. And an important part of our outreach activities is going to be to continue gathering use cases for various technologies so that we've got a fuller sense of how these are driving and enabling new services, and then test those cases against our approaches. For example, the decision model that we've drafted in the independence area that's included as Appendix A in this paper. Next slide. So you'll recall that the TWG Phase 1 report listed 7 recommendations that are laid out in 5 groups, where recommendations 3, 4, 5 right in the middle there are grouped together. For each recommendation, I'll give you a bit of an update as to our progress, what we're currently thinking. There will be greater depth for those that have obviously advanced further, but I'll touch on all of them at least briefly. Also point out that the task force is particularly keen on your feedback on recommendations 2 and 7, though we're certainly interested in any comments and suggestions that you might have as I move along here. And then the next slide. Okay, so we'll jump in. We're just going to go through these in order, starting with recommendation 1 on the critical role of ethics and professional judgment. Next slide there. Oh, sorry, we're on that slide. Perfect. As the business world becomes increasingly technology-enabled, data is being used in more ways, and systems are becoming more complex and thereby harder to understand. And in this kind of environment, trust becomes even more critically important. And the current climate seems to provide greater opportunities to promote trust through ethical behavior. Stakeholders emphasize to us that there's a real role for PAs to play in terms of ethical leadership and promoting ethical behavior as an essential and consistent foundation for organizations. This is especially true as various business processes are augmented or indeed in some cases replaced by technologies such as AI and robotic process automation. What we heard sort of consistently during the outreach activities was that consideration should be given as to whether the code should be more explicit in terms of guiding PAs about promoting ethical behavior in their organizations and with key stakeholders, including clients. The expectation was that this would likely come in the form of application material and non-authoritative guidance rather than new requirements. And I should note that our findings here are in alignment with what the Role and Mindset Task Force also heard on this topic, but our discussions are naturally framed in the more specific context of technology. On the next slide. Here are the 3 main areas that we're focusing in on. And the first of these is with respect to whether there should be a direct reference to technology way back in section 100 in complying with the code. And on this point, although our task force does see advantages to adding a direct reference to technology in the introductory section to send a message to PAs as to the increasing importance of technology, both in their roles and in the wider business and societal context, we ultimately decided that the work that was completed by the Role and Mindset Project has sufficiently addressed confidence in the profession in and around this area. So at this point, we don't expect that we'll recommend any further changes to the introductory section of the code that would specifically draw out technology. But the next option that's being explored is to whether adding application material to highlight the importance of ethical considerations when PAs are developing and using technology. This was an issue that the TWG heard repeatedly from stakeholders, and they saw it as key to the profession's ability to build and maintain trust. And so at this point, we're proposing wording that's similar to, and this is just an example, what's shown on the slide here that might be included in the conceptual framework. And the lead into the relevant paragraph that's on the slide is that professional accountants are expected to encourage and promote an ethics-based culture in their organization, taking into account their position and seniority. So then our proposed section would, or addition would highlight the ethical leadership role of the PA, specifically in the context of developing and using technology, given its potential impact. We're also anticipating opportunities, certainly in the non-authoritative materials area, to provide additional guidance, likely including some examples of PAs who are developing and or working with innovative and disruptive technologies to really highlight and show the connection between what's already in the code. Okay, and I think what I'm going to do, just in the interest of time, Galen, is I'm going to move through my deck and then look for questions, responses, and feedback to all of the recommendations at the end. Originally, I was going to take sort of a couple minutes after each recommendation, but I think I might push that if people can collect their thoughts throughout. So we'll move on to the next slide then. We'll get next into the complexity area. Then next slide again. So this recommendation relates to the level of complexity that accountants are increasingly facing in their professional environments. And now, naturally, PAs have always handled complicated matters, but we continue to hear from our stakeholders that the magnitude of complexity that's fueled by technology, among other forces, appears to be quite different, and our task force agrees with that. You'll remember that the TWG suggested that the IESBA consider a number of possible approaches. Those are shown here on the slide, and I'll talk about the specific approaches that we've been considering in a few minutes. But I first wanted to step back and provide a little bit more context for our direction in terms of some discussions that we've had. And the next slide. So our task force spent a fair amount of time at the beginning trying to distill the various elements of complexity. And I'll just say complexity is a word that we ended up choosing. It wasn't something specific that each stakeholder had raised, but rather they raised a number of different elements. And once we took a look at those elements and started grouping them and looking at some of the academic literature, there was a direct connection with complexity theory, and hence we've got the word complexity here that we're sort of trying to use to encapsulate each of these elements. They're interrelated, they're also somewhat overlapping, but we found it useful to see how complexity is manifesting itself in the professional environment so that we could evaluate the extent to which it's addressed in the code. So to begin with, the exponential pace of change that's been occurring, particularly with respect to certain disruptive technologies, this is something that puts a strain on the PA's ability to stay up to date in terms of their skill set and also to make decisions in a fully informed and systematic manner. In addition, many newer types of systems simply lack transparency and explainability that more traditional systems and approaches would have. Next, there's the matter of an increased level of uncertainty or ambiguity, and in some cases, there are contradictory forces and regulations and expectations. So, for example, when we're talking about tax planning, one of the challenges is a lack of interpretive consistency or clarity between different jurisdictions, which makes it challenging to resolve matters. The same challenges can arise when standards or regulations lag behind innovative technology products and services, and again, leave uncertainty around particular behavioral expectations. The next element of complexity that comes up, for example, when we're talking about situations where there are rapid changes or lots of interrelated moving parts, which can lead the PA to become overwhelmed. Intensity levels can be extremely high, thereby, again, threatening the PA's ability to ensure that they're in compliance with the fundamental principles. And then when complexity is high, we can run into capability constraints, including the ability to perform competently. So, for example, when working in an environment where disruptive technologies are used, the PA might be faced with a decision-making environment where there's a high level of unfamiliarity with the tools and the processes. And this ties to the observation that clients, employers, and the public have expectations that PAs act competently, but now in broader and broader areas as advanced technology becomes more pervasive and business models change and firm practice areas expand and morph, and we've got new types of measurement issues and estimates arising as well. And a final way that complexity manifests itself is through resulting resource constraints, including time constraints. These, of course, exist in many situations, but they're typically exacerbated in situations where there are many moving parts and again, where there's higher levels of uncertainty. A couple of words, these are on the side of the slide. So words that came up repeatedly in our discussions around complexity included the notion of pressure, meaning pressure on the ability to make appropriate decisions, pressure on capabilities, on resources, and so on. And we also saw close ties to the concept of automation bias that was put in as part of the Role and Mindset project, where being able to properly manage complexity could lead to being over-reliant on underlying technologies. And the next slide. Now, when we first presented our preliminary ideas to the board, the task force sensed a tendency to minimize the effects of complexity because, and this is in our view, of confounding the terms complex and complicated. And we heard a few comments to the effect of, if something is complex, there's not really a threat, you just need to increase your competence or hire an expert. But stakeholders have been telling us that it's really not that easy, and complicated is not what they mean. So we thought it'd be worthwhile to explicitly distinguish between what's complicated and what's complex. Again, trying to look at what stakeholders were raising within those elements of complexity that makes things different. There's a considerable body of research on complexity theory dating back to the 1960s or so that differentiates quite clearly between these concepts, and in our mind anyway, we really only have the common thesaurus to blame for keeping those two terms as at least English synonyms. So from our research, we pulled together the common characteristics of both complicated systems and situations and ones that go beyond this and are truly complex. And we summarized some of these here, contrasting against the simple situations that professionals quite easily solve. With complex problems, we know or can readily determine what the unknowns are. And if we don't have the expertise ourselves, we bring in experts potentially from a number of different fields to help. Those experts might still disagree, but generally they can come up with a reasonable range of answers or options. And while the problem might be extremely challenging to solve, with a complicated problem, once it's solved, it generally remains solved, and learning is readily transferable to similar problems. This is the kind of environment that we typically work in as professionals. Complex situations, on the other hand, are not business as usual, even as they become increasingly common and therefore more important to recognize in terms of their impact on ethical decision-making. In complex situations, we frequently don't know what we don't know, and the situation is dynamic, and there are synergies that play between understanding of what's likely to happen. In complex situations, although it's now essential that we involve a broad range of expertise and that we have a collaborative approach, the focus shifts to managing the situation rather than trying to solve a distinct problem or set of problems, because it turns out that complex situations result in moving target problems and multiple problems. So dealing with complex situations poses new challenges that need to be considered in order to ensure that we comply with the fundamental principles. And although a common principle to be threatened would be professional competence and due care, others can likewise also be threatened, as we pointed out in the paper. Really depends on the situation and how the professional accountant is involved. When faced with a complex situation, we'd like to see PAs to be able to identify and differentiate them from complicated problems, and then for the code to also point out some safeguards, such as things like fostering a growth mindset, ensuring sufficient collaboration between experts, so those would be more typical safeguards, as well as using experimentation and iteration to promote transparency and be able to look behind complex systems, assessing the reasonableness of system outputs given the inputs when there's a lack of explainability within the system. And then also using technologies like artificial intelligence to help assess the work of other systems where those systems are simply too fast for the human brain to keep up with. Next slide. So once we teased apart the elements of complexity, we looked to determine how complexity threatens compliance with the fundamental principles. And a question that the task force is keenly interested in is whether the current threat categories sufficiently capture the threats that result from the identified elements of complexity. And our argument is that if the PA doesn't recognize a complex situation from a complicated one, they're not going to apply appropriate safeguards to reduce the threats to an acceptable level. And they might even not recognize this issue until it's too late. So just to ensure that we're on the same page, the current categories of threats are listed here. I'm sure everyone's familiar with them. One thing to note or be reminded of is that this is currently a closed set of 5 categories, as the lead-in explicitly states that the threats to compliance need to fall into one or more of these 5 categories. And what our task force was interested in is whether a PA that finds themselves in a particularly complex situation and they realize they should consult the code, where would they land as they work through the conceptual framework to identify, evaluate, and address the elements of threat that stem from the complexity of the situation? Okay, next slide. And I guess our answer to that was that in many situations that we could envision, there was actually no clear trigger in the conceptual framework to prompt a PA to think about whether a situation's complexity in its various manifestations was threatening their compliance with the fundamental principles. Now, although there's certainly some elements of complexity that might be experienced as self-interest or intimidation to some extent, there's considerably more that's not reflected. So if you're not actually self-interested, perhaps your self-interest, in fact, is to understand the system, is to do more work, but the problem is that you're not able to because of a lack of explainability and transparency in the system, and data scientists and engineers are having the same sort of issue with the system because we're seeing a fair number of essentially black box AI systems. What do you do at that point? So everyone is innocently interested in understanding more and doing more work and doing the right thing, but aren't able to, and the threat categories aren't worded in that way at this point. On the next slide. So given that the task force believes that the current threat categories don't fully address this notion of complexity threat, we're in the process of examining 4 options to revise the code to more effectively deal with the threats created by the complexity of that professional environment. And importantly, these are not mutually exclusive options. We're actually leaning toward advancing at least 2 of these options. Just to run through them quickly, the first option is to modify the language in section 120 that currently constrains threat identification to only the 5 threat categories. So for example, the paragraph could be amended to say, threats to compliance with the fundamental principles generally fall into one or more of the following categories, and then listing the 5 categories there. The second option that we're looking at is to amend the descriptions of the existing 5 threat categories themselves as appropriate to try to build in those missing elements of complexity. So for example, we found that some of the pressure elements might fit into the existing intimidation threat if we broadened the wording of that threat and probably also recommended changing its title. The third option is to explicitly add 1 or more new threat categories, something like a complexity threat or something along those lines. And then the fourth option is that complexity and or over-reliance might be described as factors or circumstances that need to be considered within the context of applying professional judgment when following the conceptual framework. This would be an approach that's similar to what the role and mindset task force did to address the concept of bias. So over the next few slides, I'll just share some of the task force's thoughts on each option. Next slide then. So with respect to that first option, option 1, we see a lot of benefits to this option, and the task force is currently recommending that this option be implemented. So as mentioned, we couldn't find a direct fit for many of the elements in complexity, and we recognize that there are potentially other threats that have not been identified in the code. Some folks have indicated to us that they could imagine, and in fact, some of our task force members also believe, bias might be considered by some professional accounts to be a threat and to be a threat category. This would allow that sort of thinking to happen. But we think that this is also that opening of the threat categories is more aligned with the principles-based approach to make the language more permissive, particularly as it's just application material and not a requirement where more precision might be desired. Having a more open approach encourages PA professional judgment as they don't feel constrained by a predetermined list while still retaining the extant threat categories as highly relevant examples because clearly they're also working. It's also future-proofing the code if other threat categories emerge in the future. And ultimately, we don't see a downside to opening this up and allowing PAs to identify other threats and then to mitigate those appropriately. And we finally note that there are existing jurisdictions that are already using either a completely open-ended approach and or who have added different and additional threat categories. And I'll just note that our US colleagues, for example, in the AICPA are one of those bodies. Okay, and then the next slide. So with respect to the second option, building the elements of complexity into the existing threat categories, this has the benefit of retaining but broadening the existing threat categories rather than creating new threat categories. And this helps to explicitly bring complexity to the PA's awareness in terms of threat identification. In terms of risks, though, it's possible that this could lead to moving too far away from the existing threat category descriptions and thereby diluting those current categories and potentially confusing users who are already very familiar with them in their current form, which is already something that we've heard from a couple of key stakeholders. For option 3 on the next slide then, so adding a new threat category, this avoids diluting those existing categories and again explicitly brings complexity to the PA's awareness in terms of threat identification. But the challenge internally that we're having is trying to capture all of those elements concisely within a new threat category. So we might still end up missing some of the elements or creating a confusingly long threat category description, which could be tricky. And then on the next slide. So then finally, option 4, this has the benefit of recognizing the pervasive nature of complexity without having to draft new threat categories or substantively revise the existing ones. We think that this has particular appeal in combination with option 1, as the PA is then open to identify or classify complexity as a threat and treat it as such if that's how they recognize it, but otherwise they will still have sufficient guidance within the section to effectively approach and manage the complexity. On the downside of this, it is less explicit than building complexity directly into the existing threat categories or inserting a new threat or threats to try to encapsulate that. But we think it's a reasonable compromise. Next slide. Okay, so again, our strong leaning at this point is to implement option 1 as well as one or more of the other options. And I think at this point, it's fair to say we see a real possibility in option 4 being paired with option 1. And maybe what I'll do is I'm going to pause here briefly just to get feedback on this item because it's one of the ones the task force tasked me with getting some feedback on here.
So I think Brian's looking for some feedback. Let's hear from a few people. We have James Dawkin. Yeah, Jim, if you want to come in.
Thanks, Galen, and thank you for the presentation. I think the technology issue with respect to ethics and independence is particularly a more significant issue these days, particularly when you're dealing with systems and sharing of programs and whatnot. I guess my question though is, or my statement is, I think you have a lot of good information. You mentioned the application guidance, but I'm concerned that some of the users, some of the auditors may find the nature of the application guidance more confusing because it doesn't, in a sense, give a sense of direction. And a lot of times I know on our ethics technical assistance hotline that we run, we get, when we have lots of principals, we get lots of calls from individuals that want to get more of a sense of direction. And so maybe it might make sense for you to move towards identifying an additional threat or something like that, because I think it may muddle the waters with having a bunch of good information. I don't question the information, but then not knowing how to interpret it. Thank you.
I'd like to recognize Klaus Norberg.
Yes, thank you. I think this is a very good report, and also the investigations that you made on the difference between complex and complexity is very helpful. I would somewhat mirror the former speaker here. I think that the issue needs to be addressed. Yes, that's quite clear because of the developments we have there. So, and what is the best way forward here? Well, as you spell out, maybe option 2.1 and 2.4 are two ways going forward, but I really think that this needs to be tested in real life with PAs, how they react to this. And I would also, as a general comment, express that it's probably not just changing the code that is an issue here. I think it's an educational issue and also experience issues that comes in here. So we cannot just, so to say, rely that just changing the codes will also have an impact on the behavior or the views of the PAs. So it is a complex issue of addressing complexity. So I would think that going forward, trying to reach out and really field test the different approaches would be the way forward. Thank you.
I don't see any other hands, so Brian, if you want to continue or respond to either of those comments.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for both of those comments. So I didn't want to bias the options at the beginning, other than to say that the leaning of the task force at this point. I will say that each stakeholder group that we've spoken with, whether it's the IAASB's tech working group, our own board, the education panel, some professional bodies, everyone seems to have a different sort of conception of which of these options fits the best. And that may not be surprising to anyone here. So we'll have to see what we go forward with in terms of what we do on the exposure draft side when it gets to that point. But I will note that right now we are really all over the map in terms of what the preferences are. And that's making our life a bit challenging, but that's okay because it's also fun. I think a fair amount of that is going to be worked through as we get into next quarter and doing more directive outreach on this rather than just simply sort of blue skying with options, but where we've got specific language that we can take out to stakeholders and say, this is what option 1 looks like, this is what option 2 looks like, this might be 3, etc., so that you've actually got words that you can sink your teeth into and really noodle around and determine what makes sense and what sort of feels right in terms of the best way of addressing it. So, no, I really appreciate those comments.
Ryan, I'll weigh in on this a little bit. I do think that the idea of non-mutually exclusiveness in these different considerations does make sense, and I am sort of intrigued with pairing option 1 with option 4. That does make a lot of sense to me.
That's great. Thanks, Galen. Something for us to continue working on, obviously. This one's a fun one. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Excuse me. Okay, so recommendations 3, 4, and 5 are closely interrelated, as I mentioned before, as we consider the suitability of the fundamental principles for the digital age. And the task force is continuing to explore the close link between transparency and accountability, and then how that and those concepts are balanced against the concept and the fundamental principle of confidentiality. And just for a bit more context, these recommendations deal with questions relating to how well the fundamental principles contemplate and incorporate the AI ethics frameworks that are being developed around the world and the principles that are being included in those frameworks. In the next slide, so we'll start off then with recommendation 3 on transparency. Next slide again. So with respect to transparency, what the tech working group found was that in terms of heightened change and uncertainty that we're seeing more and more of, the public's expectation for transparency has become greater in order to build and maintain trust with professionals, with entities, and so on. And then just generally, there's a societal trend that's been gearing toward greater transparency. Although the concept of transparency is certainly included and implicit in certain parts of the code, we think that there is an opportunity and value in enhancing this by making it more explicit. Then on the next slide, what we're doing is framing the concept of transparency in 2 contexts. The first of these is the notion of not withholding information in a manner that would be deceptive. And the fundamental principle of integrity already requires the PA to be straightforward and honest and prevents a PA from known association with materially false or misleading statements or from omitting or obscuring required information so as to be misleading. So this element of transparency is inherent in the fundamental principle of integrity, but the task force is leaning towards suggesting a possible amendment in section 111, something along the lines of what's shown in the left column here, where the aim is just to clarify that direct connection between transparency and not withholding information so as to be deceptive. And I'll straightforwardly say as well that if someone is searching the code now for transparency, you won't find it. So it would be nice if a common word such as that you imagine within the ethics space were something that you could see in the code, and given that part of the definition of transparency is already in there, we're really just trying to tie the 2 things together. And then in the second context, transparency is not just about avoiding misleading or false information. In fact, it certainly goes beyond that in terms of societal expectations, where it also incorporates the idea of shedding enough light to inform the decision-making of others with known bounds of the extent that's appropriate in the circumstances. So this concept of providing sufficient information for stakeholder decision-making is captured in part in R113.3. That paragraph requires the PA to ensure clients, the employing organization, and other users of the PA's professional services or activities are aware of any limitations that are inherent in those services or activities. So there's a logical tie between this element of transparency and the concept of due care or diligence. And we think there's an opportunity to build on this in paragraph 113.1A3, where diligence is being described, and as you can see in the right-hand column there, basically just including that the notion of diligence includes the consideration of the level of transparency that's appropriate. And by appropriate, we're recognizing that there are clearly times, such as when audit procedures are being discussed or where there's proprietary information that's involved, transparency might not be appropriate at all. Okay, and then on the next slide, get into recommendation 4, which deals with accountability. And the next slide then. So as professional activities become more complex and services become more integrated, PAs are becoming more reliant on the work of subject matter experts, as well as increasingly relying on the outputs from technologies, things like intelligent agents, AI systems, and so on. And the recommendation in this area is to consider strengthening the concept of accountability within the principles of integrity and professional competence and due care. So once again, you can see the overlap with transparency here. The rest of the parts of this recommendation relate to material in the code that deals with relying on the work of others and the need to consider, for example, the extent to which reliance on technology should be clarified in various sections of the code. This is one recommendation where our thoughts remain quite preliminary. We're looking at how potentially to reflect accountability in terms of networks and partnerships as well. Also with respect to relying on the work of others in the context of technology development. So again, we're looking at that interplay between expectations around transparency, but then also the follow-on of accountability for PAs. In the next slide, so recommendation 5, this is the last of those AI ethics principles where the tech initiative sees a potential need for enhancement, and that's in the area of privacy and confidentiality. So the next slide, I think it's probably obvious that the importance of these concepts in terms of trust and technology can't be overstated, particularly given the ever-increasing value of data and the challenges in safeguarding it. The profession is doing a fair amount of work at this point on matters like data governance issues, such as data ownership, access, use, and all of those seem to tie most closely to the principle of confidentiality in our context. This is the other recommendation where we haven't fully formed a proposal at this point, but we're currently considering whether the confidentiality requirements could be more principles-based to ensure that they continue to address emerging issues that arise in a technology context. One of the things that we found is that when we look through the principle of confidentiality, several of the subparagraphs are quite narrowly focused, and they appear to be subsumed by other subparagraphs within the principle. So there could be an opportunity to take the requirements up a level, to streamline them using more principles-based wording, and then expand or work out the application material that's related to that. We're also considering the need to structure the application material to lay out the key issues across the data governance process and guide PAs to consider confidentiality requirements when they're designing processes and when they're setting up policies. So for example, by referring to the need for maintaining confidentiality of information throughout the data or information collection process through use, storage, dissemination, all the way through to destruction of the information when that's legally called for. Connected to all of this is the related, but here for sure, more legal construct of privacy, and whether and then if so how, this is separately acknowledged within the code. Clearly there's connections between confidentiality and privacy, but again, that notion of privacy is has its own legal components and legal definitions, and it's a matter of figuring out how to balance that with within a code of ethics, and especially one that's internationally applicable. So we're going to be delving deeper into the specific options in this area in the fourth quarter of 2020. So again, this is one to stay tuned on. In the next slide, so moving on to the next recommendation, recommendation 6. This one addresses professional competence. Next slide. Throughout our phase 1 outreach, we heard from stakeholders that although clearly the technical competencies in core areas such as accounting, audit, tax, and finance, and so on remain important, PAs are also needing to increase their requisite competence about various technologies and their application. Not to the point of being data scientists or engineers, but certainly enough to be able to identify issues and to be able to converse with the folks who are developing those systems and implementing the systems within various organizations. We also consistently heard that there's an even greater need for PAs to develop their broader professional or enabling skills. And different professional accountancy orgs refer to these by different names, but what we're talking about here is our ability to apply professional judgment and professional skepticism, to approach situations with an inquiring mind, to continuously learn, to be pervasive persuasive communicators, and to demonstrate strong ethical decision-making and things of that sort. These are particularly human differentiators that some stakeholders believe are more important than technical competence, because technical competence is something that's clearly much easier to replicate by machines. So on the next slide, in determining how to best address this recommendation, we note that although professional or enabling skills aren't referenced in the code as part of professional competence, they're very well established in the international education standards, the IESs. The IESs have also recently been revised to better reflect technical competencies that are needed in relation to technology innovations. So the task force is considering how to best leverage the IESs and their related guidance documents that are being maintained by our sister board, now a panel, the International Panel on Accountancy Education. And in order to more fully address competence requirements within the code, our task force has been talking about 3 potential approaches, all of which are related to the fact that professional competence is currently neither defined nor well described in the extant code. The first approach is to simply point to the relevant IES content directly from the code, and this would happen from within the provisions for professional competence and due care, so subsection 113. The second would be to directly embed language in the code that's strongly aligned with the wording in the IESs, but not directly cross-reference back to the IESs. And then the third approach would be to take a hybrid, incorporating some limited amount of high-level IES-aligned wording that helps within the code to establish context and to enhance understanding and promoting of the concepts, but then directing users to the IESs for the detail. Certainly some parallels in terms of what we see with the auditing standards and how those are connected within the code. So we've just started collaborating also with the education panel on this recommendation, and at this point we're thinking together that a hybrid approach seems like it makes the most sense. This is still being fleshed out further, particularly as we engage with the panel and consider their specific thoughts, given that the standards around competence are entirely within their domain, and our responsibility on the ethics side is really just to ensure that PAs are aware that professional competence is required. So that's where we're at with recommendation 6. On the next slide then, finally on to recommendation 7, and then the next slide. So our analysis here is broken out in terms of how the TWG laid out the ethics issues. The technology tools that are used in audits, the applications that are sold to audit clients, providing technology-related non-assurance services, and then lastly, more generally, the potential need for modernizing some of the code's terms and concepts. So I'll talk about the first 3 of these together, and then I'll address the fourth. And the fourth is sort of a basket of options. Okay, next slide. So starting with some background, the new technology is leading to new types of products and services, probably not a surprise. A number of them are shown here on the slide. As part of our ongoing fact-finding, though, the task force is continuing to canvass stakeholders to identify additional emerging tools and services which will continue to inform our approach. And that's absolutely where folks like you on the call today are invaluable in terms of providing some of that, some of those use cases, because you're clearly exposed to a lot of different technology and innovative sorts of issues that are happening both in firms and also within larger organizations or smaller organizations. Our principle that's arisen from, at this point, examining different examples is that we need to distinguish between technology-enabled services that are new NAS categories and those services that are really just an extension of a type of service that's already covered somewhere in subsection 601 to 610. So in other words, some services are effectively the same service as in the past, but are now being performed using or by a new tool. So for example, forensic work has always been conducted using a variety of tools. Now there's the opportunity to harness AI to perform some of those evaluations or predictions, but that clearly doesn't make it a new service. It just makes it a progression of a previous type of service that could be considered still as part of subsection 605. Similarly, if we look at recruiting services that use AI to interpret body language, these are still recruiting services, and for the purposes of independence should still be considered within subsection 609. But other services are ones that could not have been contemplated before. So, for example, we're seeing some implementations of blockchain e-commerce tools and applications or systems that are being developed and used by firms. And although some of these new services might fit within the existing subsections of NAS, some might not. So we want to ensure that we're focused then on what the output of the service is. So what is the nature of the service, and not what is the tool that's being used, so that we don't get led into wanting to write new subsections for services that are already encapsulated in section 600, or adding language that becomes dated as technologies themselves are replaced. And the next slide. Another concept that's been shaping our discussions relates to the fact that we're looking at technology as it relates to non-assurance services, but sometimes the tool or application that's being provided to a client might be more of a product than a service. As we discuss this idea further within our group, we found that the product versus service question is more of a continuum than simply an either-or. There remain pure services, of course, which are simply NAS that are being provided under the normal 601 to 610, although, as I mentioned, there might be new ones resulting from service offerings that were previously impossible or that were just economically unviable to offer. We also do see some evidence of pure product offerings, so tools or applications that don't rely on PA competence per se being built into the tool, although we do need to do a little bit more work on this to see exactly what this looks like in the wild. And then in the middle are mixed product and service offerings, such as where a client licenses a firm's technology tool, which is the product, and then perhaps also engages the firm to customize the tool for their specific work environment, a service element. And the next slide. So all of this discussion led us to develop and iterate a draft decision model, the latest version of which is shown here on the slide. The intent for you, don't worry, is not to read this here on the slide. You've got it in the agenda paper as Appendix A. I'm not going to walk through it in detail because we don't have another hour to do that. I'm happy to speak with anybody about this offline at any point, because definitely something that we're going to be socializing more during the fourth quarter. But I did want to give you some context for it. This model tries to encapsulate all of the basic ways in which a firm can advise or assist in technology development and use for a client, or license its own technology-related products, or offer technology-enabled services to clients. And the idea is to provide a roadmap for where in the code a PA should look for each type of service or tool offering. We're trying to get back to the underlying common denominators that are based on service type and away from rules and guidance that might be tied to specific technologies. Going forward, we're going to continue using this tool to test some of those use cases that we gathered during outreach. And again, we'd really like to invite you to do the same and send along any thoughts that come out of that process. None of us have a crystal ball in terms of really being able to truly know where some of these particularly more disruptive technologies are going, but to the extent that we can collaborate and use each of our individual forward-looking radar to see what's going on with firms, what clients are asking for, and so on, that will help to develop a clearer picture as to the requirements and also guidance material that we need to produce. Okay.
Brian, I want you to make sure that you get to a point where you can get some feedback from the CAG. So we might need to move along a little bit more quickly if we're going to end by 20 minutes after the hour.
Yeah, you bet, Galen. We've only got a few more slides here, so
okay,
no problem.
Thank you.
Thanks. The decision model also helped form our deliberations on relevant questions, and we've landed on a few preliminary views that I want to brew down for you here on the next slide. So first off, in engagements where we see the use of technology-enabled tools or systems providing or augmenting services that are already included in the 600 series subsections, we would propose to draft some wording to ensure that that's clear, likely providing a few examples as appropriate to modernize the code. Next, where there's a new service offering that's not yet captured within the 600 series, we've considered drafting a new section or sections to address those services. Again, though, that's not to create subsections by technology concept, so not an Internet of Things or a blockchain subsection, but rather by whatever type of new service is now being enabled. So in other words, each of these new subsections, if any, of course, would align with the level that's within the extant 600 series. So at that level of tax services, corporate finance, or so on. And then on the product front, licensing or selling a tool or a system, here we see parallels in terms of Section 520 on business relationships. And so for context, Section 520 includes the need to evaluate whether there's a close business relationship that might result if an auditor buys goods or services from a client. So turning it around, can the same question not apply if the auditor is selling or licensing a product to a client? And we think that that approach has merit in terms of the licensing of a tool or system to a client that was developed by a firm, and we would draft language for Section 520 with respect to the business relationship that's created and whether or not a close business relationship results. And the other aspect of tools that are sold or licensed to a client is that the client often requests some form of customization, and we envision that that sort of customization engagement would fall quite cleanly within subsection 606 in terms of designing or implementing hardware or software. And again, we might just need to recommend some language tweaks. And the next slide. So based on all of our work so far, and then in consistency with the other provisions in the code, at this point, we don't believe that a blanket prohibition on the sale or licensing of a tech tool to audit clients is necessary. Rather, what we're thinking about in the independence and the implications to independence and the threats from licensing or selling such a tool, we're of the mind that there's really two factors at play. You've probably heard this based on what I've been saying. So there's threats that are based on the nature of the business relationship that results from that licensing or sale arrangement. That would tie back to 520. And then there are threats to the underlying service or output that's performed by the product. And here we want to make the assumption that we need to focus on the nature of the service provided and not on who or what, such as an intelligent agent, is performing that service. It's really all about the service and attributing it back to the firm. And I just want to clarify that last part again because it's important for where we're going. The code currently expects that, it's implicit in the language that NAS work is being performed by human staff of the firm. But to some extent now, and certainly increasingly so in the future, certain activities will be performed autonomously by, for instance, intelligent agents. In other words, we're recognizing that with intelligent agents, the system might actually replace a human PA. Either way, though, the service is still attributed back to the firm. And at the end of the day, does it really matter how the services are being performed for that independence evaluation? And we don't think that it does. And then on the next slide. Okay, so let me come back then just briefly to the fourth box in the independence recommendations. These are my final two slides that have to do with modernizing the code. The first of these is with respect to the term office, given the increasing use of technology and remote working practices. And note also that this work preceded the pandemic days, so this was clearly already a factor. It's just simply been accelerated quite significantly. We've been deliberating on the use of that term office within especially Section 510 and whether an engagement partner's location is a determining factor to the extent to which they can unduly influence another partner in that office. We thought about, is there another term other than office? We haven't found anything that works so far. If someone has ideas, definitely open to those ideas. But then we did look at the definition of office and whether that remains appropriate. So again, we started looking through different professional codes most of which are directly aligned with the IESBA code. Again, not a surprise. But we did note one wrinkle within the AICPA code that appeared to us to be more conceptual and more geographically agnostic. And so on the slide here, we've got that reference, which is to formal organization or informal practice. And we found that sort of language helpful and something as a bit of a starting point for us. Okay, and then on the next slide. So with respect to routine and mechanical, here the issue is that the phrase that's used in the code is in the context of bookkeeping or admin services, and it's meant that there's no professional judgment or particular technical skills needed. So from a NAS perspective, routine and mechanical skills are seen as not resulting clearly then in particular threats to independence. But the concern is when tasks are being performed by a machine, they are by definition mechanical. And if they're done frequently or periodically, they can also be seen as routine. And so what happens is when we have an AI-enabled system that's performing tasks on a regular basis, but it's actually calling on a great deal of pre-programmed professional judgment components or expertise, how is that then classified? And our concern is that that might be mistakenly classified as routine and mechanical if it sort of fits the dictionary definitions of those terms, when in fact it's using a great deal of professional judgment under the hood. So in accordance with the different recommendations and so on, we thought about removing the term entirely and also looking at changing the definition. We're leaning toward changing the definition. This was also an issue raised by stakeholders in relation to the NAS exposure draft. And so now we're working with the NAS task force on suggested changes between us that emphasize that focus on whether professional judgment is needed, including understanding the technology that's being used, and whether there's professional judgment that's, again, attributable to the firm as a result of its role in the development of the automated tool and the means by which the tool determines or influences the output of the services provided. Okay, so that's the end of my content. Happy to take some questions or comments.
Here's your opportunity, folks. Paul Sobel, if you.
Yeah, thank you. It's obviously covered a lot of ground and we don't have much time left. I just wanted to extend my compliments to the task force. I think you've made a tremendous amount of progress since the update in March. I was very encouraged by the fact that you didn't go down in the rabbit holes. It's very easy to do with technology, but you tended to keep coming back to a very principle-based approach. And I think that has served you well and will serve you well going forward as well. As you've mentioned a few times, the pace of change in this area is very, very rapid. And I think keeping the principles front and center will help deal with that pace of change. Thank you.
Paul Thompson.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo what Paul has just said there. I think the direction of travel with the project and its proposals, I think is a very good one, keeping it very much at the principles-based level. So again, just a commendation to the task force for its work thus far.
Thank you, Paul. Don McGeechee? We can't hear you, Don. You're on mute.
Sorry, thanks very much for your presentation, Brian. That was really informative, and I appreciated all of the context. The SMP just wanted to express their preference for staff publications and things of that nature that would be outside of the code. It would provide an opportunity perhaps to be more nimble and make changes and adapt more quickly as technology changes. And it would also address any concerns about project scope. So I just wanted to pass those on.
Shigeo has got his hand up. You're on mute also. sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry.
There you go. Yeah.
I just wanted to thank the task force for their hard work, but I also want to echo what Dawn has just mentioned. I think this is a big project. It may take time to finalize it, but in the meantime, there may be some issues which require immediate attention. And in that sense, I thought that whether non-authoritative guidance could help in addressing these issues. So you may want to think about it. Thank you.
I'll invite Stavros if you have any comments on closing the session here. You're on mute also, Stavros.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Thank you very much. I was very interested to hear comments from the CAG on this presentation, because we really, and Shigeo just said something that I share very much, we're really down the road which may take a long time to come to definitive fruition. And Brian was very kind to show us all these possible directions. It's like a decision tree process. So indeed, I personally share what was said, that we may have to look into the opportunity to produce some non-authoritative guidance. But I think that Brian, maybe he can say a few words about that, but I think the task force is already thinking about that.
Well, thank you, Stavros. You know, my initial reaction was a lot of this is intuitive, and then when you start putting the pieces together, it gets complicated very, very quickly. I feel particularly that having something on privacy in the code makes a lot of sense in our current environment, and I've always been bothered by routine and mechanical, so I hope that some progress gets made on that. Brian, did you have any final thoughts?
Thanks, Galen. Yeah, just a couple of quick ones because we're out of time here again on this session. No, I just wanted to acknowledge the feedback in terms of the work of the task force. It is a large area to sort of be able to wrap our arms around, and that's probably the most difficult part. And just with respect, Paul Sobel, just with respect to your comment in terms of not going down rabbit holes, that is difficult to do, because there are a lot of stakeholders when you start talking to them that have very specific technology issues and concerns that it naturally tries to lead you down addressing that particular issue. But if we do that, we're just going to be chasing our tail forever, because there's always something new that's coming out. So it's definitely forefront in our mind. With respect to the in terms of advancing some things more quickly. So I'll note that even back to the technology working group from last year, we were working with the role and mindset group as well at that time. So some of the issues got addressed through that venue. And now we're looking at, we are working with the NAS task force on, for example, routine and mechanical, where again, we sort of see that as a priority. Stakeholders have indicated to the NAS task force that that's a priority. So it's something that's being, we're thinking we're going to calve back from the tech task force and push that through as part of what NAS is doing in terms of wording. Certainly making sure that we're aligning the two of those things. And then the last comment that I would make is with respect to non-authoritative materials, and thanks for those comments. We didn't have time to get into it today, so I didn't talk about non-authoritative, but we are actively working with IFAC to prioritize that, exactly that. IESBA, as you can imagine, right, being standard setting, it's not really our role to author non-authoritative, like outside sorts of guidance, other than staff Q&As and that sort of thing. But IFAC very much has the capacity and the interest in producing that type of material. So that's the group that we're working with to try to advance some of this thinking that does not need to be within the code, but where we would really like the profession to have more consistent guidance and ideas and thoughts and so on at that intersection between technology and ethics. So thanks for that. For that encouragement as well. We'll make sure to pass that on to our colleagues at IFAC.
Thank you, Brian, for that absolutely excellent presentation. Really appreciate your efforts there. All right, so we've come to the close of our meeting, gone over, and our next meeting, day 2 of it, will be a week from this coming Thursday, September 10th, when we'll talk about the NAS and the fees exposure drafts, and we'll be interested in your comments on those. So until then, thank you for your participation, and stay safe, folks.
Just a reminder, Galen, for everyone, IESBA CAG starts on Tuesday next week.
I'm sorry, what?
The IESBA CAG, they start on Tuesday next week, just a reminder.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.